Chapter 73. Why? Sunir asked. Because there's a secret passage leading to the Holy Crown City. What? Sunir was shocked. She had participated in the war, so she knew what this news meant. I've already spread the news. At least, the army of the Black Raven City has already known about it. They sent their army to attack the secret passage, but the army of the Holy Crown City has been resisting. When I left, they were fighting fiercely, haha. Han Jin smiled. The battle between the Holy Crown City and the Black Raven City has also alarmed the army of the Bite Man. They sent several messengers to urge the army of the Holy Crown City and the Black Raven City to withdraw from the territory of the Bite Man. Unfortunately, no one is willing to listen to them. No wonder. Morrison's patted his thigh. Today's weather is so bad. In the early morning, several knights rushed to the north like crazy. I guess they went back to deliver the news. The strength of the Bite Man has been divided into 4 parts. If they can't unite, it's hard for them to pose a threat to the Holy Crown City and the Black Raven City. How can the Holy Crown City and the Black Raven City pay attention to the request of a small castellan? Sunir sighed. I know you hate the Holy Crown City, so you try to make trouble for them. But Dismark knows better than us how important this secret passage is, and Dismark has arranged it for many years. The Black Raven City can't take advantage of it. Have you forgotten what kind of soldiers the army of the Black Raven City is? Han Jin smiled. And it's not a secret passage but a huge underground maze. An underground maze? How big is it? It goes all the way to the bottom of the Holy Crown City. How big do you think it is? Han Jin sneered. I think the good days of the Holy Crown City have come to an end. You've really tricked Dismark. Sunir sighed. If it weren't for the underground maze, today's heavy snow would have forced them to make peace temporarily. But now no one will stop fighting until one party completely occupies the underground maze. The more they fight, the better it is for us. Han Jin said slowly. Furthermore, the battle this time has already reached deep into the Beatman's territory. Will they do nothing but watch from the sidelines? I won't. Sunir shook her head and said, the armies of the 2 cities have already invaded our territory. We can't show any signs of weakness at this time. Otherwise, no matter which side emerges as the final victor, they will immediately shift their target to the Bite Man. I'm guessing that the Bite Man will have a very strong reaction. Now that they've joined forces, naturally, no one will care about us, right? Han Jin smiled. In fact, I also know that our strength is too weak. If we work hard step by step according to the normal method, we will be crushed to death at any time, anywhere, as long as someone notices us and those lords stretch out a finger. It's good that you know, Sunir said. Therefore, our only chance is to make this land more chaotic and crazy. Make them hate each other even more and even fight each other at all costs. Han Jin said word by word. After coming out of the underground maze, I snuck into the barracks of Black Raven City. Are you crazy? Sunir exclaimed. I used a kind of magic. Don't worry, they couldn't find me. Han Jin smiled and said, at that time, I saw that the morale of the soldiers of Black Raven City was very low. It was said that at the beginning of the war, Dismark didn't get any support from Wild Willow City, so he decided to abandon the small towns and use the fortified cities to fight a protracted war with the enemy. Many of the soldiers of Black Raven City and Depew City had already been exhausted. Also, Lord Zagund and Lord Mali had quarreled several times. You heard all this from the soldiers? Sunir asked. Yes. They don't know how to keep this kind of thing a secret. It seems that Zagund and Malisen are not interested in continuing the war. Sunir said in a low voice, but their goal should have been achieved. Malisen loves money as much as his life. He attacked the Holy Crown City to rob money, which is also Dismark's strength. Everyone has the same starting point. Zagund and Malisen are getting poorer and poorer, but Dismark can make the Holy Crown City richer and richer, which is not easy. As for Zigund, he not only wants money, but also a large number of people. Zigund is cruel and bad-tempered. If he is slightly annoyed, he will use all kinds of reasons to slaughter civilians and slaves. Moreover, he indulges his subordinates and never restrains the soldiers. How to say, it is not too much to describe Zigund's territory as hell. Yes. Sasu continued, this guy has the worst reputation, and he is also the most shameless dark druid. He kills his own people, then goes to other people's territories to rob them. After robbing them, he kills them again and then robbing them again. If there is really a god watching this world, a guy like Zigund should have died thousands of times. Unfortunately, Sasu stopped here and shook his head with a bitter smile. If I had a choice. Sunir paused. I really hope that we are helping the Holy Crown City to fight against the Black Raven City, instead of helping those butchers of the Black Raven City. The question is, do we have a choice? Han Jin smiled. Moreover, the Black Raven City didn't raise their butcher's knife against us, but your former allies, the soldiers of the Holy Crown City, are determined to kill us. It's meaningless to argue about this. Sunir glanced at Morrison's and Sasu. It seems that. I don't need to ask. I have seen the answer from your eyes. We are partners, aren't we? Sasu smiled. Yes, we are. Sunir stood up with a smile and walked towards the door. Sunir? Sasu cried out in surprise. Yes? Sunir looked back at Sasu, and finally fixed her eyes on Han Jin. Don't worry, I won't leave. Although this dream is too far away, but I have made a promise. What did you promise? Morrison's asked in surprise. It's a secret. Sunir smiled and pushed the door open. Good heavens, you too have secrets? Morrison squinted at Han Jin. Tell me, how many things are you hiding from us? Morrison's had learned to beat around the bush. His focus was not on the secrets, but on the magic that Han Jin had hidden. If it were him, he would never be able to escape from the encirclement of hundreds of night. Therefore, he firmly believed that Han Jin still had many tricks up his sleeve. Chapter 74. During this period of ice and snow, life was relatively peaceful. However, no one dared to slack off. Morrison's, Sasu, and even Sunir began to train as hard as they could. Han Jin's presence had undoubtedly provided them with an incomparable guarantee. One day was equivalent to a few days in normal times. What could be more exciting than this? Moreover, a charm of spirit refreshment only consumed a few dozen yuan of energy, and Han Jin's energy base was getting stronger and stronger. He did not care about this little bit of energy. The mountain village was very peaceful because the other farmers basically did not go out of their houses. It was also very noisy because Morrison's was used to releasing his combat power with his roar. There were only a dozen families here, and his roar could easily cover the entire village. Sylvia was a very strange person. God knew how Morrison's explained to her. Anyway, her actions were very difficult to understand. She often gathered her brothers, the members of the Burning Rose mercenary group that she had established. In fact, she didn't have many people to begin with. After the escape last time, a few people left the mercenary group. Now there were only 3 people left. What could 3 people do? However, Sylvia insisted on training them to form a battle formation. Sometimes they would raise their spears and sometimes they would raise their shield. Instead of saying that this was training, it was more appropriate to say that she was messing around. The most hilarious thing was that she actually asked others to address her as General. If her request was met, she would be all smiles and take the initiative to get close to you. She would even throw you a few flirtatious glances and repay you with sex appeal. If her request was not met, she would be very, very angry. No matter what you said, she would ignore you. Of course, Sylvia was also a wise person. As the saying went, it was better to share happiness with others than to share happiness with others. In order to prevent others from deliberately going against her, she simply took the initiative to give out the sweet juices. For example, General Morrison's, General Sassu, and even Stillberg became a general. Happy or bitter, time was always passing by. Several months later, it was the season of melting snow again. Nothing had changed in the village, but in another place, the army of the Black Raven City won the battle and occupied the main tunnel, driving all the troops of the Holy Crown City to the ground. Nothing had changed in the village, but in another place, the meat grinder, which had been running for several months, had killed countless creatures. Finally, the army of the Black Raven City won the battle and occupied the main tunnel, driving all the troops of the Holy Crown City to the ground. However, the situation in Black Raven City was not optimistic. The tunnel was connected to the Holy Crown City. From Dismark's point of view, a large number of enemies could appear at any time. It was like sitting on the crater of a volcano. No one could stay calm. Therefore, sooner or later, Dismark would launch an all-out counterattack. The diplomatic tone of the Biteman became more and more strict. He strongly demanded that the army of Black Raven City should withdraw and let the army of the Biteman take over the underground city. This was, of course, a joke, but a joke that must be taken seriously. In contrast, Han Jin and his companions had a much easier time. On this day, the warm sunshine was shining on the forest which had been covered by the snow. Sunir, Cessation and the others were standing in a circle, encircling Han Jin and Moxink in the middle. "Are you ready?" Han Jin asked in a low voice. "Are you still a man? If you are, you should allow me to use a sword." Morrison's University yelled. "That day will come." Han Jin smiled. "It's about to start, damn it." Morrison's looked a little flustered. "Sunir, be smart this time. Release your magic as soon as you see something wrong. Don't be like last time." "How many times have you been nagging?" Sunir didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I'm nagging?" Morrison's was really angry now. He pointed at his face and yelled. There was an obvious bruise on his face. He must have been hit by someone. At this moment, Han Jin's aura suddenly changed. He was gentle and elegant before, but now he was extremely arrogant and fierce. His pupils shrunk to the size of 2 needles. He clenched his fists so hard that the veins on his fists bulged. At this moment, Han Jin looked as if something in his body had exploded. "Not again!" Morrison's exclaimed and hurriedly released his combat aura. Michel, Stillberg, and the others immediately scattered. General Sylvia also ran far away, because Han Jin had created a new berserk spell. When he entered the berserk state, everyone knew who Han Jin was. It could be said that they had already suffered before. Even Sunir and Sassu retreated more than 10 meters away. Sassu even cast a magic shield for himself. Han Jin in the berserk state was too violent and aggressive. It made people feel uneasy from the depths of their souls. Morrison's grabbed a wooden shield and blocked in front of him. Han Jin clenched his fists tighter and tighter. His cold and sharp eyes were locked onto Morrison's. In fact, that was not the berserk state at all. It was the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts. The legends had already made the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts. It was said that the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts could make the user invulnerable. It was said that the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts could make the user invulnerable. It was said that the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts could make the user invulnerable. This was only a basic mystical art. Han Jin had seen the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts before, but he had never learned it properly, so he only knew half of it. His original intention was to master one more battle technique. However, for some reason, the spirit possession spell of the 36 mystical arts deviated a little. After his body became more agile and tenacious, and his strength increased by a lot, he lost his mind. The side effects were exactly the same as the berserk state that Sassu had mentioned. Morrison's took a step back uneasily. At this moment, Han Jin opened his mouth and said, "Be careful." Then he suddenly sprinted forward. His body was already extremely fast. When he said "be careful," he had just started moving. When he said "be careful," Han Jin had already rushed in front of Morrison's and kicked the wooden shield heavily. With a loud bang, the tall and strong Moxink, who had released his strength of fighting in advance, was forced to take several steps back before he could stabilize himself. Han Jin, on the other hand, did a somersault. As soon as his toes touched the ground, he shot out again like a sharp arrow, punching crazily on the wooden shield with his iron fist. "Quick, he's out of control again!" Sasu yelled. Sunir swung her hand and threw out the talisman that Han Jin had given her. A white light flashed and Han Jin's body froze. "I'm not playing anymore." Morrison's threw the wooden shield far away. "What's going on? Didn't you say that it would work this time?" Han Jin looked at his red fists and smiled bitterly. "When I kicked the wooden shield, I still felt something. Then I suddenly lost consciousness." Chapter 75. Do you still want to practice? Sunir asked. "Let's call it a day. I must have made a mistake somewhere." Han Jin frowned and said, "Before I figure it out, practicing won't work. Actually, I can still hold on for a while." Seeing that Han Jin didn't want to practice anymore, Morrison's finally felt relieved. However, he added another sentence to show how strong and tough his body was. Then, Han Jin's expression changed a bit. "I think we should go back to eat first," Morrison's hurriedly shouted. He wanted to slap himself in the face. "Everyone is hungry, right?" "I'm not hungry." Sasu smirked and said, "Let's get down to business. Raphael, can you figure out what's wrong?" "Damn it, I know you're the worst," Morrison said angrily. "Don't quarrel. What's that over there?" Sunir suddenly cut in. The others followed Sunir's gaze and saw a black line meandering towards them from afar. They could faintly see dozens of flags fluttering in the wind. Obviously, it was not a caravan, but a large regular army. Judging from the direction, they probably came from the north city of the Biteman. "An army?" Morrison's frowned. "An army that smelled the fishy smell." Han Jin smiled. "Fishy smell? What do you mean?" Sunir asked in astonishment. In the past, the Biteman always made verbal protests, but never took action. Why? Because they didn't want to join the scuffle. Han Jin paused and continued, "Now, I guess the battle between the Black Raven City and the Holy Crown City has already ended, so the Biteman finally couldn't help but take action." Sunir took a deep look at Han Jin. Regardless of whether Han Jin's analysis was right or wrong, the fact that he could make such a guess was enough to prove something. "Then do you think the Beatman's army will be able to gain an advantage? I don't understand these things, but I know that a sword will rust if it is not sharpened." Han Jin smiled. "How long has it been since the Biteman participated in a war?" "That's not the most important thing, is it?" Sunir said slowly. "If even this is not important, then there is nothing important." Han Jin smiled and said, "Zagund of Black Raven City is so detestable. Many people want to kill him, don't they?" However, Zagund had been living well all this while. He had survived the hatred, hostility, fear, and loathing of others until today. This was a very rare ability. Furthermore, he continued to kill and plunder. Why? I don't think anyone can deny that Zagund has an extremely elite army under his command. The army of Black Raven City is really terrifying. Sunir's face was a little pale. Obviously, she was reminded of the days when she was fighting everywhere. "By the way, Sunir, I remember the first time I met you, you were surrounded by a flock of black ravens." Han Jin paused. You didn't break into their army, did you?" "I went to find a friend." Sunir sighed. "A friend?" Han Jin was stunned. Didn't Zagund's army consist of a group of vicious people? How could Sunir have friends there? "It's not something that can be explained in a few words. I'll tell you later." Sunir said softly. Okay. Seeing that Sunir didn't want to talk about it, Han Jin didn't ask further. At dusk, a troop transporting military supplies set up camp near the small village. However, they didn't harass the villagers. Instead, they set up camp in the field on the other side of the road. Sunir and Morrisons hid on the hill and observed for a long time. After confirming that the troop didn't intend to harass the farm, they retreated to the village one after another. They couldn't be blamed for being suspicious. In the eyes of the farmer, they were very, very rich people. For example, when they bought wheat and mountain products from the farmer, Sunir and the others were very generous. One reason was that they didn't want to compete with the poor farmer, and the other reason was that most of the goods they carried were gold coins. They could only use gold coins to buy wheat and mountain products. If the soldiers knew that a group of rich people lived in the village and had bad intentions, they would be in big trouble. Perhaps their skills hadn't improved much after fleeing from one city to another, but they had firmly remembered what it meant to be sinister. Han Jin paced back and forth in the room. He couldn't understand why the spirit possession skill could make people lose their mind. This shouldn't be. The talisman couldn't be wrong, and the mental cultivation method couldn't be wrong either. He had already flipped through the 3 Taoist scriptures that his master had collected. He had also used the spirit possession skill before. Other than feeling a little tired, there weren't any other adverse effects. Could it be that the 2 worlds were different? The reason why Han Jin spent so much effort to study the spirit possession skill was because the spirit possession skill would have an extremely important impact on the overall strength of the team. Although the spirit possession skill was a very simple Taoist magic, it was on a completely different level compared to the berserk magic that Sasu advocated. The berserk magic could only increase a person's strength and numb their nerve. It could also cause a person's emotions to sink into a state of irritation, making it extremely offensive. On the other hand, the spirit possession skill didn't only increase a person's strength, it also increased their eyesight and speed. After a qualified caster used the spirit possession skill, they would be able to produce a defensive power similar to the Golden Bell shield and Iron Shirt. The rumor of being invulnerable to swords and spears wasn't just nonsense. The most important thing was that the amount of energy required to make a talisman of the spirit possession skill was about the same as the spirit refreshment spell. The cost was very small, but the benefits were huge. If Sunir and the others could use the spirit possession skill, what kind of concept would that be? Sasu would charge into the group of enemies in an unyielding manner. His magic staff would dance up and down, circling left and right, and the enemies would die if they came into contact with it. Sunir's strength would also increase exponentially. If she was given a big enough bow, she could even shoot a thick log as an arrow. As for Morrisons, needless to say, Han Jin dared to guarantee that Morrisons would definitely like that feeling. However, all of this had to be done before he could solve the problem of losing his mind. Han Jin thought nervously as he walked, completely forgetting about the time of day. After an unknown amount of time, he suddenly heard a soft sound coming from outside. At this moment, he happened to be standing by the door, so he pushed it open. The first thing Han Jin saw was a pair of beast-like eyes, filled with despair and hatred. Then, a cold light went straight for his throat. Chapter 76. A few months ago, after he had almost been killed by that woman in the tunnel, Han Jin had specially strengthened his physical training. Although the woman's appearance was very abrupt, Han Jin still reacted in time and took a small step back when the cold light suddenly pierced him. Seeing that his dagger had missed, the opponent was stunned for a moment, and an anxious expression appeared on his face. He then rushed towards Han Jin and shouted, "Don't move!" Even a woman would shout at this time, and Han Jin was never one to wait for death. He took another step back and swung his right hand forward. A dazzling ball of fire shot out. Seeing this, the opponent was shocked and dodged sideways. The ball of fire brushed past his shoulder and hit the wall. With a boom, A large hole was blasted in the wall. "Damn it, what's going on?" Morrison's cursed in the distance. "You're a magician?" the assassin cried out in shock. Then, he gritted his teeth and his body gradually faded until he finally disappeared into thin air. Han Jin sneered. He waved his hand, and a wooden puppet suddenly appeared where the assassin had disappeared. It swung its thick arms and hit everywhere. The assassin was hit somewhere, and his body staggered as he appeared. Finally, he knelt on the ground with a thud. Han Jin finally saw that there were 2 black arrows stuck in the assassin's back. They were deeply embedded in his flesh, and the blood around the wounds was bright red. The assassin had not been injured for long, at most half an hour. "You!" The assassin struggled to raise his head. He wanted to say something, but the wooden puppet had already taken a step forward and punched the assassin with its fist. Although he knew that the situation was not good, he no longer had the ability to dodge. Blockhead's fist heavily smashed into his back, and the wound was instantly torn open. Blood splattered everywhere, and the assassin let out a muffled groan before falling limp to the ground. "What's wrong?" Morrison's rushed in with his sword raised. He also saw the assassin on the ground and cried out in shock, "Who is this guy?" Han Jin was just about to speak when Sasua's voice came from outside. "Not good. Not good. Quick." Han Jin was stunned for a moment. He couldn't care less about the unknown guy. He hurriedly rushed out of the room and almost collided with Sasu. "Quick!" Sasu panted and said, "Everyone, pack up. We're leaving this place immediately. Those soldiers are suddenly rushing towards us." Sunir walked out of the main room. She listened carefully and shook her head. "It's too late. They have a knight. Weren't they fine earlier?" Morrison's asked in shock. "Why are they suddenly coming after us?" Han Jin turned his gaze back and quietly looked at the unconscious man. After a while, he said, "Maybe it's because of him. Come, let's throw him outside." Not long after, a group of knights rushed in from outside the village. The village was so small that they could clearly see the figure lying on the ground from outside. There was no need for them to search from house to house. A knight jumped off his horse and strode over. He reached out and grabbed the man's hair. After carefully examining him, he turned around and shouted, "Sir, we've caught him. Young master! Young master!" Suddenly, there was a cry from the knight group. Looking in the direction of the cry, Han Jin and the others saw an old man in his 50s who was struggling to get up. The knight beside him couldn't hold him back, and the old man fell off his horse. The knight cursed and picked up his spear. Just as the old man struggled to get up, a knight's spear swept from behind like a poisonous snake and hit the old man's thigh heavily. "Ha ha!" Looking at the old man who was wailing in pain, the knight group burst into laughter. Humility, honor, sacrifice, valor, compassion, faith, honesty, and justice were the principles of the knight group. Unfortunately, the world had been in chaos for too long. The knight group had evolved from the guardians of justice to the tools of governance. Perhaps there were still people who remembered the principles of the knight group, but it was definitely not the people in front of them. "Young master." The old man's hands were tied behind his back, and his legs were injured. He couldn't stand up, but he crawled towards the unconscious man. Han Jin's heart suddenly jumped. The old man's cry reminded him that when he had just arrived in this world, Stillberg had also called him with the same sad voice. But he didn't want to meddle in other people's business, so he could only turn his eyes elsewhere. "Young master." The old man let out a blood-sobbing cry. He finally crawled to the man's side and kept pushing and bumping him, trying to wake him up. However, the man had been injured and forced to escape here. He was like a lamp that had run out of oil. Moreover, he had been punched several times by the wooden golem. It was impossible for him to wake up in a short period of time. "Old man, why bother?" A knight laughed and said, "You'd better come with us to see the castellan. You are all a group of beasts." The old man's eyes almost popped out, and he roared with all his strength. "What did you say?" The knight's face turned cold. Yukito, how did the castellan treat you? Without the castellan's care, you wouldn't be alive today. The old man was not afraid at all. But how did you treat the castellan and the young master? Old man, the castellan said that he wanted the Leger alive, but he didn't say that he would let you live. I let you go with us for the sake of the young master. Do you understand? The knight said gloomily, You dare to scold me again. The knight's tone was tough, but his words revealed his fear. First, he said the word young master, and then he left a way out for both sides. The old man knelt on the ground, and sat up with his head supporting his body. He sneered, Yukito, have you forgotten how you flattered the castellan and the young master? Ha ha! You are just like a dog that can wag its tail. To a guy like you, let alone once, even if I scold you 10 times, so what? Bastard! 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 The knight's face turned livid, and he suddenly rushed to the old man with his spear. The old man became more and more tough at the last moment, and he kept scolding until the knight's spear pierced his mouth and came out from the back of his neck. His scolding stopped abruptly. Bah! The knight spat with hatred, and then shook the knight's spear hard, and the old man's body was thrown out of the knight's spear. Chi Li's eyes were full of tears. The old man's loyalty and bravery moved her from the bottom of her heart. Thinking of the guards who died together with the human-faced eagle to protect her, Chi Li almost cried out. Chapter 77. Yukito turned his horse around and was about to go back when he met the eyes of Han Jin and the others at the door. Han Jin and the others kept the bottom line of not making trouble. But it was another thing to judge Yukito. The old man had made it clear before his death that this knight named Yukito was an ungrateful bastard. Therefore, everyone looked at him with contempt. Yukito understood the eyes of Han Jin and the others, and could not help but become bold. To be honest, he didn't have much courage. In this chaotic world, he only wanted to make a living. His previous master had refused to obey the city lord's orders and had been killed on the spot. For the sake of his own future, it was understandable that he would change his master's allegiance. The problem was that he could either be a good person or a bad person. It required a certain amount of ability and wisdom to be a two-faced person. Otherwise, it was easy to make mistakes. If he wanted to be a good person, he would have taken the young master away. Although the life of a fugitive was not easy, it was much better than being condemned by his conscience every day. If he wanted to be a bad person, he would have torn off all his disguises and killed the old steward. How could there be so many troubles? And the young Master Leger would have had no chance to escape. It turned out that wavering was the worst attitude. Yukito had no one to complain to. Why? He didn't want to go too far. He wanted to be nice to the young master, but the young master took the opportunity to slip away. He didn't want to kill the old steward. After all, he had tried to please the old steward. But he was scolded and lost his face. How could he command these knight in the future? Now, seeing that even some villagers dared to show contempt to him, Yukito could not control himself anymore. He shouted, Why are you hiding in this place sneakily? Are you spies of the Black Raven City? Han Jin and the others were stunned. How could they cause trouble without saying anything? Before they could explain, Yukito waved his hand. Come on, catch them all. Several knights rushed over. Seeing the fighter badge on Morrison's chest, he was a little scared. He whispered to Yukito, Sir, Yukito slapped him in the face and roared, Carry out the order. The knight gritted his teeth and threw caution to the wind. He raised his knight's gun and pointed at Han Jin and the others. He shouted, Put down your weapons or you will be responsible for the consequences. Do you hear me? Put down your weapons. Han Jin let out a long sigh. This was too outrageous. There were all kinds of reasons before, but what about now? Morrison's and the others all focused on Han Jin. First, he helped Morrison's and the others with various magic. Then, he voluntarily put himself in danger in exchange for their safety. Finally, he put forward a clear goal or an ideal. Although the ideal was far from reality, it pointed out the direction of their efforts. Again and again, Han Jin's position in everyone's mind was unshakable. Han Jin raised his head and looked at the knight named Yukido. He said word by word, F***CKU. What? Yukido was stunned. You're really an idiot. Every time you hear someone curse you, you always want them to repeat it several times. Do you like it? Han Jin said in a sarcastic tone, Well, I'll satisfy you. F***CKU. Morrison's walked forward slowly with a grim smile on his face. He looked at the other knight coldly. His greatsword was ready to be unsheathed at any time. Sunir sighed, stepped back, jumped on the roof, and took off her longbow. Sasu held his magic wand and cast a magic shield on himself, waiting for the battle to break out. Stilberg, Michel and the others disappeared as fast as they could and hid in the cellar. Although Han Jin's team didn't have its own discipline, they had formed a style. At least they knew what they should do and where they should be. This time was different from the last time. The knight they met last time belonged to the elite troops of the Holy Crown City, including the Great Knight. They were no match for them at all. However, the knight in front of them was much weaker than them. To put it bluntly, they were only responsible for escorting the supplies. Yukido was trembling with anger. He knew that he was too reckless just now. He didn't see the fighter badge on the chest of the enemy until now. But at this point, there was no other way to solve the problem except to fight. The horse under Yukido snorted uneasily. It was purely a coincidence that the horse's hoof stepped on the unconscious man. The man groaned and opened his eyes. He saw a group of knights approaching slowly with spears in their hands. On the other side, there was Han Jin with a sneer and Morrison's with a greatsword. Then he lost consciousness again. Go! Yukido roared angrily. Just then, a strong arrow appeared silently and shot into Yukido's back and out of his chest, bringing out a rain of blood. Yukido looked at the arrow cluster with an unbelievable look, and then fell down from the horse. Han Jin was stunned. When did Sunir's archery become so artistic? How could she kill the enemy from the back with a sharp turn? He turned to look at Sunir on the roof ridge and saw a pair of eyes full of shock and nervousness. A group of black things swooped down from the sky. Those creatures looked like bats, but were much bigger than bats. Their wings were 3 meters long and their pupils were red, emitting a faint red light. They looked very horrible and had sharp fangs in their mouth. Those creatures suddenly folded their wings and fell down one by one. They fell among the night and turned into hideous humanoid creatures. They all had long and thin nails, which looked soft but were actually very sharp. With a scratch, the knights' armors were torn apart like paper. At the same time, their bodies were torn apart. Even the horses couldn't escape. Streams of blood splashed everywhere. Countless pieces of flesh and internal organs fell to the ground like raindrops. The whole village turned into a slaughterhouse in an instant. Those monsters harvested lives like a farmer harvesting crop. They stepped on the squeaking flesh and wore the blood of one life or another. Every time they turned, there would be drops of blood thrown out by them. The knight who had been swaggering a moment ago had now become a group of lambs waiting to be slaughtered. But what Han Jin didn't understand was that although those knights were on the verge of total collapse, they still kept fighting. In fact, it was not that they didn't want to escape, but they knew that they couldn't escape at all. God! It's Sagun's vampire guard. Morrison's face had turned pale. Chapter 78. A few black figures strolled through the bloody street. They all had pointed ears, which indicated what race they were from. However, compared to Sunir, their temperament was completely different. They had black hair, black pupils, black soft armor, and even the slanted longbows on their back. Their bodies were filled with a thick, insoluble darkness. However, their faces were very pale, which made them look frightening against the black background. The leading elf walked to Yukido's body, bent down, and searched for a moment. She found a crystal seal. She smiled and glanced to the side. Her eyes fell on Sunir, who was standing on the roof. She said softly, "Sunir, we meet again." The Biteman Knight had all been killed. The vampires were still not satisfied. They were about to attack the Morrisons who were guarding the door. However, they stopped when they heard the elf talking to Ykoto. "Why are you here?" Sunir asked coldly. "Do you remember the Silver Pegasus army from 20 years ago? We are learning from you, hee. The elf smiled. "Isn't Zagund known as omnipotent? Does he need to learn from others?" Sunir sneered. "Your tone is very unfriendly." The elf sighed. "Although I don't want to blame you, you have to understand that you can't be forgiven every time. If you can't control your tongue, you will bring disaster to yourself." Sunir snorted, but she didn't retort. Obviously, her side was at a disadvantage, so Sunir didn't want to provoke a conflict. "I can feel the hostility in your heart. Why do you have to do this?" The elf said softly. "Actually, Master Zagund is not as bad as you think, and Dismark is not as good as you think." "Dismark is our ally after all," Sunir said lightly. "What a good ally!" The elf smiled. 20 years ago, Lord Cassa gained the loyalty of several red dragons, but he was killed by Dismark in the end. Everyone knew that if the Silver Pegasus army and the elf team didn't go deep into the rear of Cassa's army and attack them at all costs, Dismark would have lost in the end. "But what did you get in return after making such a heavy sacrifice?" Sunir suddenly became silent. "According to the agreement, you should have divided Cassa's territory equally, but Dismark took more than 80% of the land. He only left some wilderness for you. Cassa had operated in Anqing for decades, and left behind a large amount of wealth and military resources. Dismark took them all." The elf smiled. "The funniest thing is that if Dismark wasn't busy expanding his territory, and instead chose to lead his army to the west and attack Master Zagund with Wild Willow City, would there still be a war like this? This time, Wild Willow City rejected Dismark's request for help. I personally agree with this decision. There is no need to cooperate with this kind of person." Sunir still didn't say anything. Her face was hidden behind the mask, so no one could see the change in her expression. But one could imagine that her face wasn't good right now. There are no eternal enemies in this world. The elf smiled. "Master Zagund appreciates your attitude. I think now is the time for us to try to be friends." "Friends? Huh." Sunir was so angry that she laughed. "How many of our people did Zagund kill? Can we forget all of that? Didn't you also kill our people?" The elf slowly said. "Don't be as short-sighted as Dismark. You need to look further. If I thought that I could be friends with you, then I would be truly short-sighted." Sunir sneered. "Right now, Zagund has to fight against Dismark while also preparing to deal with the Beatman's counterattack. That's why he's worried that Wild Willow City will take advantage of the chaos to send troops, right? After this moment, who would he still want to be friends with? Hazel, don't waste your time talking with them. Leave it to me." A vampire walked over with an evil grin. "Don't meddle." The elf frowned. "Our mission is to destroy the Beatman's supplies." The vampire froze for a moment, then angrily said, "Hazel, are you ordering me?" A cold light flashed in Hazel's eyes, but she was very apprehensive about the identity of these vampires. In the end, she helplessly sighed, turned around, and walked back. The elves hurriedly followed behind her. The vampire coldly looked at Hazel's back, then he waved his hand and said, "Kill them for me." His voice was very loud, as if he was trying to show off to Hazel. The group of vampires rushed forward like a swarm of bees. Morrisons angrily roared and released his Do-Chi to protect himself. At this time, he could only fight to the death. All of a sudden, something exploded in midair. Rays of golden light shot out like countless arrows, sweeping across the surrounding space of several hundred meters. The vampire's charge came to an abrupt halt. Shrill screams rang out one after another. 2 vampires even fell to the ground. Their arms waved frantically as they tried to shield themselves. It seemed like they were resisting the rays of golden light that could penetrate through every orifice. The golden light dissipated. The appearance of the vampires had changed drastically. Countless wounds that looked like ulcers appeared on their skin. There was also a black, sticky liquid flowing out of them. Han Jin slowly walked out from behind Morrison's. His face looked calm and composed, but his heart was in turmoil. He knew the power of the Pure Light spell. If the Pure Light spell was used to attack the spirits he released, it could instantly turn them into ashes. However, the performance of these vampires was too shocking. They were only slightly injured and still had a strong combat ability. "We don't want to be friends with you, but we also don't want to be enemies with you," Han Jin said coldly. "Before I change my mind, get out of here. Otherwise, I don't mind cleaning up this world." The vampires and the elves were companions, but they could turn angry over such a small matter. It could be seen that their personalities were very tyrannical. When dealing with such creatures, it was useless to lay out facts and reason. If you had overwhelming power, they would give in even if you didn't say anything. "Master! Master Hazel!" the leader of the vampires hurriedly called out. The vampires involuntarily took a few steps back. They were not afraid of warriors or magicians, but priests were their natural enemies. Besides, Han Jin's words were very firm. They thought that the priest in front of them really did not want to hurt them, and was only giving them a light punishment. If they continued to attack, the priest would definitely release a powerful spell. Hazel turned around and looked at Han Jin seriously. He smiled, then continued to walk out of the village, ignoring the vampires. "Let's go," the leader of the vampires said hatefully. Without the elven archers to solve their problems, they could only turn into ashes in the holy light. It was a very foolish choice to insist on fighting the priest. Chapter 81. Only caring about killing and not burying. This kind of behavior was really outrageous. Looking at the bloody scene in front of them, Han Jin and the others were a little worried. Stillberg, Michel, and little Joseph didn't look too good. Such a cruel scene wasn't something they could encounter at any time. At least, it was definitely the first time for Michel and little Joseph. Even Sasu and Morrison's looked worried. Only Han Jin and Sunir were able to keep calm. Han Jin slowly walked to the bloody scene and pushed aside the dismembered corpses. The man called Leger was revealed. Han Jin bent down and carefully observed for a moment. He was still breathing, and his pulse was light but stable. Han Jin couldn't help but sigh. This kid, his luck couldn't be any better. One had to know that Leger still had 2 arrows stuck in his back. The scene just now was extremely chaotic. People were running, horses were jumping, and the vampires were also rushing to kill. If anything had kicked the arrows, it would have torn open Leger's wounds. The fact that Leger was able to survive could only be attributed to luck. "Morrison's, come and help me." Han Jin waved his hand and called out. He didn't want to cause trouble earlier, but if he didn't help now, he would feel bad. Although he didn't know Leger well, he had a feeling that they were in the same boat. They were both young masters in dire straits, and both had a loyal servant. It was just that he was a little luckier, living in a small town without any powerful enemies. That was why he was able to protect himself and Stillberg. If the roles were reversed, he could only stretch his neck and wait for death. What was that sour remark about? "We're both in the same boat, why should we have known each other before? That kid isn't dead?" Moxink was also surprised. Then he strode into the room. He didn't feel anything when he was outside, but after entering the room, he had a totally different feeling. No matter how careful he was, he would step on something soft, slippery or sticky, which made his scalp tingle. With every step he took, the muscles on his face would twitch, and he even had the impulse to shout out loud in his heart. The 2 men lifted Leger and rushed out as if they were escaping. They found a clean place and gently put Leger down. Morrisons looked at Leger's wounds and whispered, "Can you save him?" "No problem," Han Jin nodded. "His body is very strong. If it was someone else, it would be hard to say." Morrisons rubbed his hands. He seemed very happy. Of course, he was happy for himself. As a warrior, this kind of thing was inevitable. If Han Jin could save Leger, he would be able to save Morrisons in the future. It was a strong guarantee. Sunir jumped down from the roof. "The vampires are heading for the barracks. We can't stay here. Everyone, pack up. We're leaving now." "What kind of luck is this?" Sassu smiled bitterly. Morrisons and the others looked at each other, speechless. God knows what kind of influence they had. Anyway, they couldn't live a peaceful life. At most, they could rest for a few months. After that, they would have to run away because of various reasons. "This is our fate. Accept it," Han Jin said calmly. He always kept his ideological and political work in mind. From the current situation, this team was relatively stable. Morrisons, Sunir, and Sassu could be said to be good people. They didn't scheme against each other and had a tacit understanding with each other. Of course, they also had their shortcomings. The first one that needed to be addressed was their lack of ambition. Therefore, he had to persuade them at all times. Fate. Morrison smacked his lips and fell into deep thought. Usually, everyone would put their important things in Sunir and Han Jin's space rings, so there wasn't much to pack. After a while, everyone walked out of the village. Fortunately, the village was in the mountains, so they could retreat into the mountains at any time. Han Jin had already dug out the arrow from Reg's back. Though he had never been a surgeon, he had some basic knowledge, such as disinfection, etc. The mantra of rending in the secrets of looting sixting was a spell used to treat wounds caused by knives and weapons, so there was no need to worry about bleeding and pain relief. Although it was already the beginning of spring, the night wind was still very cold. After walking for about 10 miles, Chi-Li, Michel, and the others couldn't stand it anymore. They were shivering as they walked. Seeing this, Sunir found a valley to hide from the wind and led everyone in. When the bonfire started burning, everyone sat around it to warm themselves. Morrisons tried to find something to talk about. "Sunir, didn't you say that elves and dark elves are mortal enemies? Why didn't they fight just now? Do you really want to fight?" Han Jin was both angry and amused. "No, I just feel that it's a little strange. Mortal enemies." Sunir chewed on these two words and sighed. "Morrisons, if you had brothers and sisters, would you be mortal enemies with them?" "Of course not. Actually, we are all children of the forest. Although there are conflicts between us, and the conflicts are getting worse and worse, to the point where it can't be fixed. But, how do I put it?" Sunir paused. "You don't understand. Every time I kill a dark elf, I have a very strange feeling in my heart as if I have committed an unforgivable crime." "You've killed dark elves before?" Morrisons was shocked. "How many did you kill?" "I can't remember. Similarly, I can't remember how many of my people have died in the war." "You can't remember?" Morrisons shivered and muttered, "I really can't tell. It would be fine if she couldn't remember other things, but she couldn't even remember how many people she had killed. Just thinking about it made him tremble in fear. "Remember, it's war," Sunir said coldly. I know, I didn't say anything." Morrison smiled. "Right, Sunir, that dark elf called Hazel said that they are learning from you. What does that mean?" Sassu interrupted. 20 years ago, the Silver Pegasus army penetrated deep into the rear of the Kasa army and attacked everywhere. They destroyed a large amount of supplies and severely affected the Kasa army's movements. Sunir said indifferently. "Now you know what it means, right? You're saying that Zagun sent out his vampire guard and dark elves?" Sassu jumped up. "More or less. It's over." Sassua's face turned pale. Zagun's army had a special characteristic. They would stop at nothing. The Silver Pegasus army penetrated deep into the enemy's rear and only attacked military targets and troops. The vampires, on the other hand, were monsters that lived for destruction and slaughter. Their arrival would definitely turn this place into a world of misery and suffering. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. The fact that Leger accepted his gratitude proved many things, including the reason why he was lying here and what happened. After a while, Leger said softly, "You got yourself into big trouble. Really, you shouldn't have helped me." "Trouble?" Han Jin laughed. "I don't care about trouble. Ever since he came to this world, he had been in a lot of trouble. Unlike the current Leger, Han Jin had always kept himself clean. Therefore, his calm and carefree expression was clearly reflected in Leger's eyes. At this moment, to Leger, Han Jin was a very charismatic person. That kind of temperament was hard to describe with words. It was really convincing. At least, it convinced him. Leger didn't know what to say. Thank him? Instead of using words to thank him, he would rather remember this kindness in his heart. "All right, you should rest early. Recovering from your injuries is the most important thing." Han Jin smiled. "If you want to leave after your injuries are healed, we won't stop you. If you want to stay with us, as long as we have something to eat, we won't stop you." After saying this, Han Jin drew a charm of spirit refreshment in the air and threw it into Leger's body. Leger was shocked at first, then felt very ashamed. He subconsciously thought that his benefactor was attacking him with magic. After a while, he could clearly feel the changes caused by the charm of spirit refreshment. His face changed and he said in a trembling voice, What magic is this?" "A magic that helps people." Han Jin smiled. His smile had an unfathomable meaning. Sasu slowly opened his eyes. From an angle that Leger couldn't see, he gave Han Jin a thumbs up. Only those who had experienced it could understand that feeling. Which professional in the world didn't want to reach the peak? However, those who had enough confidence in themselves and could see hope were few and far between. This was because their talent was limited, their energy was limited, and their time was even more limited. Han Jin's magic overturned all of this. As long as they could get Han Jin's help, the future would definitely not be a dream. Sasu recalled how he felt when he first tasted this kind of magic. He knew very well how tempting it was to any professional. "You're awake?" Han Jin smiled. "Shoo." Sasu put his index finger in front of his lips and pointed to the side. Following Sasua's finger, Han Jin almost laughed out loud. Before they fell asleep, Morrisons and Sylvia whispered to each other for a while. After they fell asleep, the two of them were naturally pressed together. However, Sylvia was not sleeping well. One of her legs was pressed against Morrison's chest, and her breasts were pressed against Morrison's face. The two of them were entangled together. Morrison's, on the other hand, was sleeping soundly with a sweet smile on his face. In fact, Morrison's was very alert when he slept. He didn't even know that he was being pressed against by someone. It could only be said that Sylvia's breath made him feel very comfortable and at ease. "Raphael, do you know what's going on between the two of them?" Sasu asked in a low voice. "Didn't Morrison's tell you?" "No, I asked him. He told me to mind my own business," Sasu replied gloomily. "Sylvia is his teacher's daughter. The two of them grew up together," Han Jin said with a smile. "As for what's going on between the two of them, I don't think I need to tell you, right? You should be able to see it yourself." "Yes, I know that Sylvia likes Morrison's a lot. But does Morrison's like Sylvia too?" "Of course," Han Jin said softly. "After all, the two of them have been together for more than 10 years. However, Morrison's can't stand Sylvia's temper. He's very troubled, so he deliberately talked to me about it." "This guy," Sasu said angrily. I asked him, and he told me to get lost. But he took the initiative to talk to you. He's looking down on me. Morrison said that you have a cunning face. He doesn't trust you. Telling you this is equivalent to giving you something to use against him. Han Jin chuckled. Sasu was not convinced. However, when he looked at Han Jin's handsome face and warm smile, he knew that he could not compare to Han Jin in this aspect. Sasu sat down beside Han Jin and said with a smile, "Tell me, what did Morrison's talk to you about? That's not good." Han Jin was a little hesitant. What's not good about that? I'm not going to tell him," Sasu said anxiously. "Actually, it's very normal." "Sasu, have you ever imagined your future wife?" "I'd have." Sasu rolled his eyes. He was going to ask about Morrison's secret. Why was he being dragged into this? "Your imagination must be perfect. She must be gentle and generous, smart and beautiful. Anyway, the person in your imagination is always full of strength. As for weaknesses, there's not a single one." Sasu was stunned. Of course. Who would imagine weaknesses for no reason? That's the contradiction between reality and dreams. Han Jin said softly, "Morrison's is the same. He thinks that his wife should be perfect. That's why he doesn't think that Sylvia will become his wife. However, he likes Sylvia." "Then what did you tell Morrison's?" "I told him that everyone has their own weaknesses. Not just other people, Morrison's has them too." Han Jin paused. "What do you think is the most troublesome weakness of Morrison's?" "He's not hygienic," Sasu said through gritted teeth. He was deeply troubled by this. After training with the sword, he's not only sweaty, but he also likes to run around. He wouldn't listen to me. He said that it's the smell of a man. Tui. That's what I said at that time. I asked him if Silner had ever despised him. Han Jin said softly, "Actually, liking someone doesn't only mean liking her strengths. You also have to accept her weaknesses. Sylvia is a good person. Because of her naivety, she's not a Philistine." When Morrison's was still a teenager, Sylvia liked him. I think, no matter how high Morrison's climbs in the future or falls, Sylvia will definitely be by his side. This kind of relationship must be cherished. "You're right," Sasu said softly. "Of course, Sylvia's weaknesses are as obvious as her strengths. Because of her naivety, she seems very childish. She doesn't know how dangerous people can be. She doesn't know how difficult the world is. She will always bring trouble to herself and others." "You just said, Sylvia is naivety, so she's not a Philistine. Now you're saying that because of her naivety, she seems childish?" Sasu smiled bitterly. "I'm confused. Is naivety a good thing or a bad thing? Did you see Morrison's sword?" "I saw it." Sasu was even more confused. "Why? Actually, many things are double-edged blades. If used well, they can help people. If not, they can harm people." Sasu paused. "I'm curious. When Morrison's heard you say this, he didn't become confused." Monthly summoning ticket. This is the first day on the shelf. Brothers, give me some motivation. Apart from the scheduled updates at 1 p.m. and 6 p.m. every day, I'll also update regularly. I'll definitely do what I say. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 83. Even if he's confused, do you think he'll say it out loud? Don't you know him well after spending so much time with him? Han Jin chuckled. That guy will never allow anyone to insult his intelligence. Even if he doesn't understand, he'll pretend to understand. That's right. Sasu also laughed. Then, his gaze fell on Leger. Oh right, you're Leger, right? There was one thing that everyone had repeatedly talked about. The lack of a qualified thief in the team had caused inconveniences in many aspects. Leger's appearance fulfilled their wishes. Sassu was well aware of the reason why Han Jin used magic to seduce Leger. Yes, hello. Leger smiled. My name is Sassu. From now on, we're friends. Please take care of me. Leger was slightly stunned. Then, he smiled. If you don't mind that I'm a burden, I'll do my best. Sassu turned to Han Jin. He even glanced at Leger from the corner of his eyes. What he meant was, do you think this person is suitable? Sunir had previously been worried about not being able to rope in people casually. So far, this small team was still very united. Although everyone kept some secrets, they could still trust each other. If they attracted a stinky fish, then the result would be a fishy pot of soup. Han Jin thought for a moment and slowly nodded. Leger's old servant was able to face death with such a resolute attitude. This proved that Leger and his father were both extraordinary. Loyalty was very flexible. There weren't many people who were foolishly loyal. Take himself and Stilberg as an example. If he beat and scolded Stilberg every day, he would do the things he enjoyed and let Stilberg suffer. It was fine for a short period of time, but in the long run, would Stilberg be able to endure such an inhumane life? Any relationship in this world is two-way. Sassu trusted Han Jin's judgment and changed the topic. Raphael, what do you think we should do in the future? The Bite Man is going to be in a mess soon. Sai, what kind of world is this? I can't even find a quiet place to stay. We don't have the ability to change anything. We can only take one step at a time and go with the flow, Han Jin said slowly. Bite Man? What's wrong with the Bite Man? Leger was shocked. Zagun's vampire guard and dark elves have broken into the Bite Man. How could this be? Leger wanted to get up and ask, but he pulled at his wound and groaned in pain. Calm down. We're not the only ones who can't do anything about this. You're the same. Han Jin bitterly smiled. Let's ask Sunir tomorrow morning. I can't do anything about it either. Sunir's voice sounded. The Vampire Guard is similar to the Silver Pegasus Army. They're both known for their speed and flexibility. The Beatman's army has no way of dealing with the Vampire Guard who's avoiding a decisive battle. What if you were the commander of the Bite Man? What would you do? Han Jin asked. Sunir paused. Did you notice? The Vampire Guard uses tactics of breaking up the whole into small groups. That's why we met those 10 or so vampires. If I were in command, I'd spend a lot of money to hire a large group of mercenaries. They'd split up and fight to the death. The regular army would be in charge of supporting them from the side. When the Vampire Guard feels that they've sacrificed too much, they'd withdraw themselves. But with the Vampire Guard style, the Beatman's losses won't be small. At least a few hundred small villages will be turned into ruins, or even more. Is there no other way besides this? You can ask the dragons for help. Sunir's expression was very complicated. There was mockery and hatred in her eyes. She was probably thinking about the battle that caused the Silver Pegasus army to collapse. But the dragons are very interested in watching the races of the continent kill each other. I'm guessing that they won't care about the Beatman's life or death, even though they also hate those creatures of darkness. Forget it, let's not talk about this anymore. Han Jin said softly. Let's all go to bed early. We still have a long journey tomorrow. They couldn't talk about this topic anymore. Leger's emotions seemed to be getting more and more agitated. He was obviously very concerned about the Beatman's safety. If they continued to talk about this, the idea of recruiting Leger might fail. The night passed silently. The next morning, Morrison's yawned and slowly opened his eyes. When he saw the scene around him, he couldn't help but jump in fright. Everyone had already woken up. Everyone's eyes were focused on him. Their gazes were very strange. Morrison's only just realized that half of Sylvia's body was on top of him. His hands were wrapped around Sylvia's waist. Morrison's was so embarrassed that he immediately pushed Sylvia away. However, Morrison's strength was a little too strong. Sylvia's body flew more than a meter into the air. With a thud, she fell to the ground in an extremely unsightly position. Even the most sound asleep person would be startled awake by this kind of attack. Sylvia suddenly opened her eyes. However, she still didn't move. She probably still didn't understand the situation. The next moment, Sylvia felt a sweet taste in her mouth. Waves of pain came from her lips. She had bitten her own lip during the collision. Sylvia jumped up and roared, Who? Who the F***ck dares to throw me? About half of the people reached out their hands and pointed at Morrison's. Sylvia took a step forward and grabbed Morrison's ear. She roared, Do you want to die? Morrison's pulled a long face. He was a reasonable person. If Sylvia had grabbed his ear for no reason, he definitely wouldn't have tolerated Sylvia's temper. However, he was in the wrong. He wanted to explain, but he didn't know how to. He wanted to admit defeat and say a few nice words. However, how could a man admit defeat to a woman in front of so many people? Ahem. Han Jin coughed dryly. I think we should buy some tents. Otherwise, it'll be too inconvenient at night. Yeah. Sasu nodded in agreement. Sylvia, don't blame Morrison's. I think he just had a nightmare. He was kicking and hitting like a madman. You just happened to be lying on top of him, so he threw you out, Sunir said gently. However, her voice was filled with laughter. Yeah. Sis, I didn't do it on purpose. Morrison's smiled apologetically. You're useless. How old are you? You're still afraid of nightmares? Sylvia's face was filled with resentment. Han Jin and Sasu were speechless. Actually, Sunir's main point wasn't the nightmare, but that she was lying on top of Morrison's. However, Sylvia didn't realize it at all. Perhaps she thought it was normal? Gossips. It was said that Sylvia's father had passed away a long time ago. After that, the two of them relied on each other. There must have been a lot of stories that happened. Sylvia let go of Morrison's ear. Then, she realized something was wrong. The leather armor in front of her chest was wet. When she fell on the ground, it was covered in mud. Damn it. Why is it so wet here? The dew from yesterday was so heavy. This time, everyone couldn't hold it in anymore. Everyone burst into laughter. Actually, camping in the wild wasn't a good thing at all. Because of the improper posture, it was understandable that one would drool while sleeping. The problem was that it shouldn't be displayed so openly. Morrison sighed and turned over to sleep on the ground again. He could only use the ostrich tactic. Could he not get up? What are you guys laughing at? Sylvia stomped her foot and said angrily. All right. Han Jin quickly came out to smooth things over. Michelle, it should be enough, right? Yes, it's done. I also brought some bread. Let's make do with it, Michelle replied with a smile. Hearing that it was time to eat, Morrison's got up reluctantly. As a melee professional, he couldn't go against his own stomach. Otherwise, his combat ability would be greatly reduced. Michelle didn't prepare a lot of food. However, in this winter, Han Jin's power had greatly increased. His total energy was close to 100 unit. He no longer relied on food to replenish his energy. Without such an unfathomable consumer, the food was enough to fill everyone's stomachs. Michelle's workload also became lighter. Reg, you are from Biteman, so you should be very familiar with this place. Where do you think we should go at this time? Han Jin asked suddenly while eating the bread. Reg, you are from Biteman and should be familiar with this place. Little Joseph was feeding Leger. Hearing Han Jin's question, he withdrew his hand and stepped aside. Leger hurriedly swallowed the food in his mouth. Then, he pondered for a moment. Let's go to Ninth Town. Is it safe there? Ninth Town is in the rear of the capital. It should be safe there. I have a friend there who will take care of us. With your identity, aren't you afraid of getting him into trouble? Han Jin asked in a low voice. Leger's expression changed. Then, he sighed. Then we'd better go to the capital. Although Bite City is called the City of Treachery and has been laughed at by people for a long time, its defense is still very strong. The Vampire Guard can't take it down. In fact, what we need is a quiet place. Bite City is too big. It's inconvenient. Han Jin smiled. As long as we don't contact your friend in public, it should be fine. You mean to go to Ninth Town? Leisure asked. Yes. Leger was a bit confused. Since they had decided to go to Ninth Town, why did they say so much? Pack up. We'll set off right away, Han Jin said in a low voice. He always believed that if you wanted to see through a person, you couldn't wait until the moment of life and death. That would be too late. In fact, it was possible to understand a person's integrity from a small point of view. If Leger had explained how capable and loyal his friend was, he would have thought that Leger was untrustworthy. However, Leger immediately changed his mind and didn't want to get his friend into trouble. This was enough to prove Leger's character. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 84. Some people liken war to a game of chess. Actually, compared to the various changes on the chessboard, war was much more complicated. Zagund had placed the Vampire Guard behind the Beatman's back with the intention of delaying the Beatman's counterattack and disrupting the Beatman's plan. However, no one, including Zagund himself, had anticipated the changes that followed. If Zagund was the most notorious lord in the area, then the Vampire Guard was the most notorious army in the area. Things like rape and pillage were simply too mild for the Vampire Guard. Brave men eat barbarians' meat when hungry, drink the blood of Xiongnu with laughter. These were only two lines of poetry used to express and vent a deep-rooted hatred. However, the Vampire Guard had turned all the unimaginable and unimaginable things into reality. In the past, the Vampire Guard was a mad dog, but the chains were always in Zagund's hands. They would only move when Zagund ordered them to bite people. After biting people, they would obediently lie down at Zagund's feet. But now, the Vampire Guard had completely gone out of control. Not to mention Zagund, who was far away in the underground city. Even the commander of the Vampire Guard was unable to restrain his subordinates or even find his own subordinate. After the tyranny that had been suppressed by Zagund was released without restraint, the Vampire Guard had completely gone crazy. They had already forgotten their goal and mission, and were only killing for the sake of killing. Inside and outside the mountains, on the plains, beside the river, everywhere was a bloodbath. Even their master, Zagund, was caught unprepared, not to mention Han Jin and the rest. The road to the north could be said to be difficult. On the first day, they could still summarize their experiences and think about tomorrow's arrangements and countermeasures. On the second day, they felt very tired. On the third day, they had already become numb. Small-scale attacks were everywhere, all the time. Sometimes, one or two vampires would dare to attack them with a sinister smile. Of course, when they discovered that the situation was not right, the vampires would use their fastest speed to escape. As for whether they could make the vampires stay, that would depend on Han Jin and the rest's ability and cooperation. The most painful thing was that they had a huge burden on their back. In the massacre of the Vampire Guard, there would be more or less a few survivors. They would spread the news to the other villages, and then the villagers would start to escape. On the road there were such people everywhere. The vampires' energy was limited, and they could not vent it all day long. This also gave the people a chance to survive. Most intelligent life forms were social creatures, especially in times of crisis. They would always gather together spontaneously. Behind Han Jin and the rest, there was a tale like this. There were about 400 to 500 villagers following closely behind them. Needless to say, everyone knew how serious the situation was, because they were being attacked more and more. With such a large tail, the vampires would discover them from afar. It was unbearable. Should they use violence to chase all the villagers away? It had to be admitted that everyone had this idea, but before they could say it, they rejected it themselves. Faced with the faces and eyes that longed for survival, no one could harden their hearts. When survival had become a luxury, this reality itself had a kind of infectious power that was enough to move most people. Of course, from the initial annoyance, to the later helplessness, and then to the current acceptance of fate, there was a process of change in attitude. It could not be done overnight, because everyone had the instinct to avoid disaster and seek good luck. At this point, they really had no choice. At noon on the 5th day, Han Jin and the rest stopped to prepare lunch. The villagers behind them also took the opportunity to sit down and rest. After another annoying morning, no one said a word during lunch. They were really too tired. Damn it, where did the Beatman's army go? Morrison's suddenly cursed fiercely. I'm very suspicious. Did the Bite Man really prepare for war? It's already been a few days, why hasn't there been any reaction? Sunir laughed bitterly. They prepared for the whole winter. It should be about time, right? Sasu said slowly. Everyone was silent. No one could answer Sasua's question. Leger opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but swallowed his words. At this moment, a little girl around 5 or 6 years old ran over with small step. She stood a few meters away, sucking on her fingers, and looked at everyone quietly. Little guy, what's the matter? Sasu asked with a smile. Yes. The little girl nodded vigorously, then ran over to Sasu. She took out a handful of beans from her pocket and handed it to Sasu. Sasu was stunned. He stretched out his right hand and the little girl placed the beans in Sasua's palm. Then, she took out another handful, but the capacity of her little pocket was very limited. This time, she only took out a few beans. The little girl giggled and ran back with small step. A young couple came up and grabbed the little girl. Their faces were full of flattering smiles, but this world was very harsh on them. They had never been given a chance to interact with powerful people, so their expressions were very stiff. I told you not to disturb the adult. Why didn't you listen to me? The young couple scolded the little girl. The little girl looked very wronged, and her big eyes were filled with tears. Don't scold her. Little Joseph couldn't stand it anymore and shouted. The couple was shocked. They quickly nodded and bowed to little Joseph with a smile. Although little Joseph was young, he was able to be with the adults. Naturally, he was a great little adult. Not bad little guy. You know how to care for a girl at this age? Morrison's laughed strangely. Little Joseph blushed, lowered his head, and didn't say anything. Haha, did you see that? This little guy is blushing. It seems like he really knows. Morrison seemed to have found a treasure. Knows what? Sylvia said fiercely. Do you think everyone is like you? You don't know how to care for people. What? What did I do? What do you think? All right. Everyone is watching. Han Jin said softly. It seemed like he should find a chance to talk to Sylvia. This was not good for men, but he didn't know if Sylvia would accept his suggestion. Sasu played with the beans in his hand. He reached out and picked one up. When he was about to put it into his mouth, Sunir suddenly said, Think carefully before you eat. This isn't a normal bean. It's a life-risking fruit. Sasu was stunned. He immediately understood what Sunir meant. Life-risking fruit? So what? He had already put the bean into his mouth. Han Jin sighed in his heart. From a purely beneficial point of view, they should think of a way to drive the villagers away. The more people there were, the higher the chance of encountering vampires. However, his idea couldn't be approved, and he didn't have the heart to do so. If they encountered hundreds of vampires attacking the villagers, they definitely wouldn't try to save them. It was purely a suicide mission. The current crisis was hidden and invisible, so everyone was very relaxed. Do you guys want to eat? Sasu said with a smile. Life-risking fruit, is it? I'll try it too. Morrison's University grabbed a small handful and put it all into his mouth. Raphael, how about you? Sassu put his hand in front of Han Jin. Han Jin smiled. He had used various methods to test others, so naturally others would test him. This was very normal. Han Jin grabbed the rest of the beans and said softly, I haven't eaten this kind of thing before. Don't fight with me. Sunir wasn't in a hurry to say anything. She just sat there quietly. When it came to personal experience, perhaps no one here had the qualifications to compare with her. The hardships and bloodshed of thousands of miles of battles and narrow escapes were unimaginable to ordinary people. It was also because of this that she developed a maverick personality. I only hope that we won't encounter a large group of vampires, Sunir said slowly. Our luck won't be that bad. Besides, didn't the vampire guard already scatter? Sassu shook his head. After being taught by the little girl, the villagers suddenly found a good way to communicate with the adult. One after another, children ran over and put all kinds of food around everyone. Some children even threw some copper coins and even silver coins. The temporary camp was a bit chaotic. Stillberg, clean up. We'll take the food and return the money, Han Jin said. Stillberg hurriedly jumped up and asked the children to take the money. Han Jin and the others were all rich people. This amount of money was just a drop in the ocean for them, but it was not a small expense for the villagers. The villagers temporarily elected a few elders to talk to Stillberg. They said that it was a small gift from everyone and asked Stillberg to accept it. Of course, Stillberg wouldn't accept it. The two sides argued until their faces turned red. Stillberg had probably never been respected like this in the past 10 years. He didn't know whether it was because he was excited or anxious, but his face turned red. At this moment, a series of soft hissing sounds came from afar. Everyone's expression changed slightly. They looked up into the sky and saw a few black dots flying closer and closer. In a moment they were above the crowd and kept circling around. Damn it, these annoying monsters. They don't even let us rest for a moment. Morrison's cursed and stood up with his greatsword. The crowd was in chaos. The villagers rushed towards Han Jin and the others with their children. The past few days had clearly taught them that the closer they were to the adults, the safer they would be. Sunir quickly drew her longbow. She didn't even aim. She raised her hand and shot an arrow. A faint black light streaked across the sky. The vampire that became the target flapped his wings and dove down diagonally, dodging Sunir's arrow. He then folded his wings and fell into the crowd like a stone. Get out of the way! Morrison's roared and rushed forward, but the crowd rushed towards him like crazy. He couldn't move at all. Chapter 85. Sunir was a little annoyed. She pulled out a magic arrow, but the rest of the vampires had already swooped down when they saw the archer. By the time Sunir pulled back her bow, it was already too late for her to aim. The vampires became very excited when they landed in the crowd. Since they were surrounded by ordinary people, they could unleash their full power. They slithered through the crowd like fish, and every time they waved their claws, they would take away a life. Screams of agony could be heard everywhere. Hearing the screams of their companions, the crowd became even more frightened. They ran around aimlessly, shouting, and even collided with each other. Those who were weaker were knocked to the ground, and then mercilessly stepped on by dozens of feet. It was a little sad that they were not killed by the vampires, but were trampled to death by their companions. Morrison's was very anxious, but he could not catch up with the vampires, nor could he catch them. Sassu and Sunir could only stare at them. They could not lock on to them, so naturally they could not attack. Han Jin shouted with all his might, "Get down!" Many people heard Han Jin's shout and hurriedly got down on the ground. Those who did not hear him noticed the strange behavior of their companions and subconsciously fell to the ground. Although their movements were not orderly, they still succeeded in making the vampires stand out. Die! Morrison's University shouted. The sword in his hand turned into a beautiful river of stars, rolling towards the vampire closest to him. The vampire bared his fangs and revealed a very ugly smile. His figure quickly retreated. Morrison's leaped into the air again and chased after the vampire. Seeing that Morrison's had locked on to him, the vampire's face became even more ferocious. He let out a sharp scream, and the other two vampires simultaneously surrounded Morrison's. Morrison's was not afraid at all. Just as the two sides were about to collide, a dazzling light exploded. Countless golden rays shot out like arrows and nailed everything within a radius of dozens of meters. The crowd, vampires, and Morrison's all turned golden. The three vampires screamed at the same time, but Morrison's was not affected at all. His sword suddenly sped up, and the bright starlight penetrated the vampire's chest and came out from his back, bringing with it a rain of black and red blood. Teamwork also needed to be honed through actual combat. During the previous few encounters with the vampires, it was always Han Jin who released his magic first, followed by Morrison's and the others who attacked. The advantage of this was that the battle was always easy. The disadvantage was that the powerful vampires could adjust in time, escape in time, and then find their companions to come back for revenge. Therefore, Han Jin and the others had already changed the steps of their cooperation. They would either not attack, or they would make sure to annihilate all of them. Sunir released her finger, and a sharp arrow shot out. It accurately shot into the ear of a vampire and pierced deeply into it. The vampire staggered a few steps and fell down on top of a woman in her 20s. The woman didn't dare to raise her head. Suddenly, she felt something sticky on her neck and couldn't help but scream in fright. Sasu raised his wand at the same time, and a twisted bolt of lightning fell from the sky and hit the last vampire. If it was against ghosts, not counting Han Jin who could release strange magic, Sasua's attack was the sharpest in the team. However, it was not enough to deal with vampires. The lightning bolt could only tickle them. Morrison's tried to pull out his sword and kill the last vampire. At this moment, the vampire in front of him suddenly grabbed the edge of the sword. The nails on its right hand pierced through the air, making a sharp whistling sound as it tried to grab Morrison's wrist. Morrison's University was shocked. He hurriedly let go of the sword and took a few steps back. The vampire's eyes were glowing red, and it stared at Morrison's. Its gaze was filled with hatred. Its left hand tightly grasped the edge of the sword and pulled it out bit by bit. Morrison's sword left a transparent hole in the vampire's body. After the sword was pulled out, the vampire could even see what was behind it. Streams of viscous dark red blood flowed out from the hole, but the vampire stood firmly and did not move at all. It was as if its legs were rooted to the ground. How is this possible? Morrison's was very surprised. Along the way they had killed many vampires, but this was the first time they had seen such a strong one. The vampire took a deep breath, then opened its mouth and spat out a green ball towards Morrison's. Ah! Amidst the screams, a woman suddenly jumped up. That green thing happened to stick to her back, and the woman's movements came to an abrupt halt. A thick fog rose from her body, and her skin and muscles were corroded at an extremely fast speed. In the blink of an eye, she became a pale white skeleton. Morrison's was not the only one who was shocked. Sasu and the others were also dumbfounded. Sunir drew her bow and silently shot an arrow. The vampire suddenly raised its arm in front of its face, and the arrow hit the vampire's arm. Ha ha! The vampire let out a sinister laugh and took another deep breath. Morrison's did not have time to retrieve his sword. He retreated as fast as he could, but his speed was not as fast as the spell. A rain of black and red blood droplets shot out, sweeping across the surrounding people. Morrison's expression changed. He did not know what kind of spell this was, nor did he know if his combat aura could protect him. However, the area covered by the rain of blood was too large, and there was no way he could avoid it. At this moment, A wooden golem appeared in front of Morrison's. Although it was forced back by the rain of blood, it firmly blocked Morrison's path. Screams of pain rang out. Those who were ordered to lie on the ground were not as lucky as Morrison's. About 30 people were hit by the rain of black and red blood droplet. They all rolled around, struggled, and screamed. The vampire straightened its body and took another deep breath. A dazzling golden light suddenly shone, and then a silent arrow approached the vampire under the cover of the golden light. No matter how strong the vampire's body was, its eyes were weak. Under the illumination of the golden light, it could only close its eyes. Sunir's arrow flashed and shot into the vampire's open mouth. Following that, a flame shot up into the sky, turning the vampire into a man of fire from inside out. The vampire let out a shrill cry. It could no longer cast any spells. If the flames were burning outside its body, it might be able to resist the damage. However, if the flames were burning inside its body, it would be a different story. The last vampire wanted to help attack, but when it saw its comrade releasing the rain of black and red blood, it hurriedly retreated to the side. Obviously, it was also afraid of that kind of magic. Now that it saw its comrade's fate, it knew that there was no need to continue fighting. It immediately transformed into a strange-looking bat, spread its wings, and fled into the sky. Sassu had finished chanting the long incantation. Seeing that his chosen opponent was about to escape, he sneered. He pointed the magic staff in his hand at the sky. The bat screamed and fell straight to the ground. It flapped its wings with all its might, but it could not fly. For anything that could fly, the gravity spell was an irresistible magic. Dragons could ignore the attacks of ordinary gravity spells because of their incomparably strong magic resistance. Otherwise, they would also fall from the sky. Morrison's rushed forward. He spun around and picked up the giant sword that the vampire had thrown. The giant sword released a dazzling light once again. Morrison's body brushed past the vampire's body. A head that was still burning flew into the sky. The vampire swayed and fell to the ground. Morrison's continued to rush forward. The bright blade of the sword came down. The struggling bat saw that the situation was not good, and returned to its vampire form. Before it could get up, a ball of golden light bloomed in front of it. In the next moment, Morrison's sword had landed on its head. The hardness of the vampire's head was far beyond Morrison's expectations. With a loud bang, his sword bounced off the vampire's head. The vampire was heavily smashed to the ground by the force of gravity and the huge impact. However, Morrison's had the advantage of using his sword to test the hardness of the vampire's head. Morrison's raised his sword again and stabbed it down with lightning speed. The tip of the sword pierced through the vampire's neck and pierced deep into the ground, nailing the vampire to the ground. Han Jin slowly walked over and waved his hand. A talisman floated toward the vampire. When the talisman landed on the vampire's body, it suddenly turned into a golden curtain of light and enveloped the vampire. The vampire struggled for a moment, then stopped moving. Han Jin secretly heaved a sigh of relief. These vampires were very powerful. In the past, he only needed to cast a pure light charm to end the battle. Today, he had cast it several times. Fortunately, there were only 3 vampires. If there were more, the consequences would be unimaginable. The cries of the crowd gradually subsided. Of course, they could not return to normal. The silence meant that their lives were fading away. What's going on? Can someone tell me how a vampire can cast magic? Morrison's University asked. He was also scared. I don't know. Sunir slowly walked closer. Her eyes looked very serious. I've never heard of a vampire who can cast magic before. Sassu, what about you? Do you know of such vampires? I don't know either. Sassu smiled bitterly. We might have killed a big shot and then... Sunir stopped talking. Then what? Morrison's asked. Then big trouble will come knocking on our door. Sunir sighed softly. I will update as promised. Friends with monthly tickets, please support me. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 86. Although Han Jin and the others ended the battle in a short period of time, the villagers still suffered heavy casualties. There were about 50 to 60 corpses on the ground. Moreover, no one cared about burying the corpses. Who knew when the vampires would appear again? Han Jin and the others hurriedly packed up the corpses. They didn't care whether the villagers could keep up with them or not. Leger had explained in detail that the west city of the Bite Man was about 150 kilometers northwest. The vampires probably wouldn't dare to attack there, so the most important thing now was to try their best to reduce the time spent on the road. However, at this moment of life and death, the villagers also burst out with their potential. They gritted their teeth and followed behind the group. They walked from noon to dusk. The group of a few hundred people had already stretched to a few miles long, sparsely scattered. Stillberg, little Joseph, and the others couldn't take it anymore. Seeing Han Jin stop and look back, they didn't care whether Han Jin was going to tell them to stop and rest. They first sat down on the ground and gasped for breath. In the whole group, the most relaxed people were probably Leger and Chili. In order to ensure everyone's fighting strength, they couldn't let the others carry Leger. Han Jin released 2 wooden talismans and let the wooden puppet carry one on its back and the other one in its arms. Although it was a bit wasteful, they couldn't be too careful at this time. The villagers who arrived one after the other also sat down on the ground. Some of them even directly lay down, wailing. "Let's rest here today," Sunir said softly. "That's the only way." Han Jin nodded, then slowly sat down on the ground. After the wooden puppet placed Leger and Chili on the ground, its body trembled, then suddenly fell forward and disappeared without a trace. A small grayish-white wooden sculpture rolled into the grass. Little Joseph had good eyesight. He quickly jumped up, found the small wooden sculpture, and respectfully handed it to Han Jin. Han Jin took the wooden sculpture. The Trent's body was green, and so was the wooden talisman. Now, the small wooden sculpture had turned grayish-white, and it was covered with small cracks. With a gentle pinch, a series of small cracking sounds could be heard. In Taoist terms, the spiritual energy on the sculpture had been used up, and the small wooden sculpture had become a piece of rotten wood. "Throw it away. It's useless now." Han Jin smiled. "Can you give it to me?" Little Joseph asked timidly. "What do you want it for?" Han Jin stared blankly. Seeing the hope in little Joseph's eyes, he vaguely understood something. He then took out a wooden talisman from his space ring and drew a few new talismans in the air. If he were to release it himself, he wouldn't have to go through so much trouble. If he were to give it to someone else, then he would have to make up for all the talismans. "This is for you. Take it." For me?" Little Joseph was surprised and happy at the same time. "Yes." Han Jin nodded. "Didn't you learn magic from Sasu? Use your spiritual energy to try to touch it." Little Joseph stared at the wooden talisman. After a while, he said in surprise, there's a very strange feeling. It's really strange." "Then you can release it now." "Thank you," little Joseph said respectfully. Han Jin looked around and saw that Stillberg's face was full of envy, but he didn't dare to ask for it himself. Han Jin smiled. "Stillberg, come here. There's one for you too." Stillberg happily jumped up. "Young master." Han Jin took out another wooden talisman and completed it. He handed it to Stillberg. "I don't think I need to teach you." "Yes, young master, I will." Stillberg carefully put the talisman in his pocket. "Ahem." Sunir coughed. When Han Jin looked over, she glanced to the side. Following Sunir's gaze, Chili and Michelle were staring blankly at Stillberg and little Joseph. Han Jin couldn't help but sigh. Were they eating from the same pot? Chi Michelle, come here. You have a share too. Han Jin called. I don't need it. I'm safe with you guys protecting me. Chi paused for a moment, then smiled. Who can guarantee that there won't be any mistakes? Han Jin said slowly. If we can't help you in time, you can save yourselves. You don't have to be so polite. Sunir smiled. Raphael is right. I'm just afraid that something unexpected might happen. Chi and Michelle didn't refuse anymore. They walked up to Han Jin, and Han Jin put the two modified talismans in their hand. Raphael, what about mine? Morrison's came over with a smile. He even put his hand on Han Jin's shoulder to show the close relationship between the two. Get lost, Han Jin replied without hesitation. Are you serious? That's so unfair. Morrison's yelled with a long face. Don't mess around. Making puppets requires magic power. Sunir said. Then she turned to Han Jin. Raphael, apart from Holy Light, do you know any other spells that are more powerful? Sunir also realized that the power of Holy Light was greatly reduced when dealing with powerful vampires. They had to find another way. Yes. Han Jin nodded. Then why haven't you used it before? Is it because it takes too long to prepare? Sunir was overjoyed. If that's the case, we can protect you with all our strength. How powerful is that spell? If the enemies are all vampires, it should be able to kill hundreds of them, Han Jin said honestly. Then why are we running? Morrison's jumped up. At the current speed, I'll be able to use that spell in 3 years. Damn. Morrison's didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Only then did Sunir realize that she had been teased by Han Jin again. She couldn't help but roll her eyes. The coquettish look in her eyes suddenly brightened up. Han Jin's eyes were sharp. He was curious. What kind of face was hidden behind that mask? It was said that elves were very beautiful. Han Jin said, Sunir, how long have we been together? About half a year. Don't you think it's time for us to see your true face? Maybe we'll be surrounded by vampires soon. At least don't leave us with regret. Yes, yes. Morrison's agreed with Han Jin's suggestion. He yelled, Sunir, is there a rule in your tribe that you have to marry whoever sees your true face? You've been listening to too many stories from the bards, haven't you? Sunir said calmly. It's fine. I'd like to recommend someone to you. Morrison's acted as if he didn't understand what Sunir meant. He patted Han Jin's shoulder and said, This is Mr. Raphael, a great prophet, a great puppet master, a great priest, a great magician, and a great noble. It's not an insult to be able to gather so many great things in one body, right? Sunir and Han Jin were stunned. They all knew that Morrison's liked to talk nonsense, but what he said was a little too much. It made them feel awkward. They didn't know whether to refute or not. Morrison saw that the atmosphere was very tense. It was too different from what he had imagined. He quickly changed the topic and said, By the way, if you include the berserk spell, Raphael is also a warrior. Moxink was right. Although Han Jin's physique was not as strong as Moxink's, he was still very strong. Especially after being blessed with the madness, his speed and strength had been greatly improved, but he had no fighting strength. Moxink was right. Although Han Jin's physique was not as strong as Moxink's, he was still very strong. Raphael, how's the research on the berserk spell? Have you made any progress? Morrison's was obviously trying to find something to talk about. As long as he could successfully divert Sunir's attention, it would be fine. He couldn't stand the cold feeling. Unfortunately, Morrison seemed to have forgotten that in order to research the berserk spell, one needed to have a research target. Morrison's was the best target. Han Jin looked at Morrison's seemingly concerned expression and laughed in his heart. He was walking right into the trap, wasn't he? If you didn't mention it, I would have forgotten. Don't worry, after we settle down, I'll seriously research it with you. After hearing Han Jin's words, Morrison's realized that he had just climbed out of a hole and immediately fell into a deeper one. He couldn't help but want to cry. But to be honest, this is the first time I've seen someone who can dabble in so many fields. Prophet, puppeteer, priest, and magician. Raphael, how did you do it? Sassu wasn't trying to resolve Morrison's embarrassment. He was just asking a question that everyone wanted to know the answer to. Even Sunir's gaze turned to Han Jin. She also wanted an answer. This is very complicated. Han Jin pondered for a moment. Maybe in the future. We'll talk about it when there's a chance. Everyone was slightly disappointed, but they didn't pursue the matter. This was a personal matter. For example, Sunir had always been wearing a mask. Were they going to force Sunir to take off her mask? Since you're a puppeteer, why don't you create a mount? You should be able to bring many people with you. Leger suddenly broke the silence. Han Jin was stunned. It wasn't that he couldn't do some things, but that he couldn't think of it. He used to create wooden puppets mainly to protect himself. He had never thought of wasting his energy elsewhere. However, with his current energy absorption speed, the consumption of creating phase was negligible. Just now you said that if I continue to wear a mask, I'll leave everyone with regret. Is that right? Sunir softly interjected. Han Jin was stunned. Wasn't the topic over? Why did Sunir bring it up again? Great Prophet, please allow me to address you as such for the last time. Sunir revealed a bitter smile. Sunir's words were filled with an ominous feeling. Han Jin suddenly remembered that Sunir had said that everyone was surrounded by vampires. This would leave them with regrets. He hurriedly raised his head and looked towards the sky. Under the faint twilight, a large number of black dots were rapidly flying towards them. There were at least a few hundred of them. Han Jin was immediately dumbfounded. Brothers, I'm in danger now. I'm gradually being pushed out. Those who have monthly votes, please help me. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 87. Morrison's, Sassu, and the others had all turned into statues. Hundreds of vampires formed a dark cloud, surging towards them with an incomparably ferocious aura. Their mood had already reached its lowest point, and the word despair was not enough to describe it. If there were a dozen or even dozens of vampires, they could still muster up the courage to fight to the death. But now everything was meaningless. With so many vampires gathered together, it was very likely that there was a monster at the level of the Vampire King among them. Not to mention the few of them, even if there was an 11th grade Supreme Knight leading them in battle, they might not be able to defeat this group of vampires. Oh my God! A few of the villagers exclaimed. The rest of the villagers raised their heads and quickly noticed the abnormality in the sky. Some of them screamed, some of them crawled up and ran into the forest, and some of them wailed loudly. Immediately, the situation became chaotic again. Raphael, you should have a way to leave, right? Sunir asked softly. Han Jin was stunned. Go, don't worry about us. Morrison's continued. This warrior who usually liked to argue and pester people was surprisingly calm at this moment. After a flash of despair, unwillingness, and other emotions flashed past his eyes, it was filled with a lonely smile. Young master, you should leave quickly. Stilberg also shouted. We don't have no chance at all. Han Jin said slowly. I can let you recover your strength and then, it's useless. Sunir shook her head. You and Leger may be able to escape, but we can't. Instead of running around like dogs, it's better to fight to the last breath. How do you know if you don't try? Han Jin said anxiously. Sunir slowly raised her right hand and took off the mask on her face in a carefree manner. Then, she shook her head, and her smooth golden hair flowed down like flowing light. What was hidden behind the mask was a breathtakingly beautiful face. Her snow-white cheeks were extremely delicate, and a pair of pale green eyes were emitting a dazzling radiance. Her curved eyebrows with a golden hexagram between them, her handsome nose bridge, and those round lips formed an incomparably pure picture that made people feel relaxed and happy. "You see, you should have no regrets now, right?" Sunir smiled. Morrison stared blankly at the hexagram between Sunir's eyebrows. "You are a coincidence." Sunir replied softly. "Listen to me." Han Jin was so anxious that the veins on his forehead. "Now, listen to me." Sunir interrupted Han Jin. "I don't have anything good here. Magic crystals. You'll find a way in the future, but I'll leave this to you." With that, Sunir took out a small black box from her space ring and handed it to Han Jin. Han Jin didn't take it. He suddenly sighed. "I really don't understand. Why are you so stubborn? Do you still want to protect them?" The thing that Han Jin regretted the most now was being too indecisive. If he had chased away all the villagers earlier, they wouldn't have ended up like this. Sunir didn't say anything. Her right hand was still hanging in the air, holding the small box firmly. At this time, Sasu, Michel, and the others also came over. Sasu whispered, "Raphael, let's go. The result will be the same whether you stay or not." Han Jin suddenly felt very irritated. It had been almost half a year since he came to this world. The biggest reward he gained was making these friends. Was he really going to give up? Of course, he was still very young and could start all over again. But if he were to encounter the same situation again, would he give up again? Listen to everyone. Sunir smiled. She then grabbed Han Jin's hand and tried to put the small box on it. Han Jin backhanded the small box and sent it flying. Fortunately, the small box was very sturdy. It flipped a few times and fell to the ground, but it was still intact. "You!" Sunir opened her mouth in shock. Han Jin ignored Sunir and looked up at the sky. He couldn't accept leaving now, and he couldn't accept dying for no reason. Instead of dying here, it was better to stay alive and avenge everyone in the future. As for what he should do, Han Jin didn't know. He really didn't know. While they were talking, the black dots were flying closer and closer. Sunir sighed softly and bent down to pick up the small box. Everyone pulled out their swords and held their wands. After all, they were all professionals. Although the difference in strength was too great, no one would stretch their neck and wait for death. The black cloud formed by the vampires didn't stop for a moment. It flew straight over. This strange scene made countless people's brains freeze on the spot. Sasu had already released a magic shield. He held his wand and stared blankly at the sky. He didn't know what to do. Morrison's greatsword almost fell to the ground. His mouth was so wide open that it could almost swallow an ordinary person's fist. Han Jin's hands that were rapidly forming seals stiffened. Fortunately, his state of mind was much higher than his current energy level. Otherwise, he might have gone crazy. In contrast, the villagers were the first to react. A burst of cheers erupted from the crowd. Those who were too tired to get up, and those whose faces were still covered in tears, got up one after another. They shouted and jumped around, venting the joy of surviving a disaster. Han Jin didn't know whether to laugh or cry. What was this called? They had already been forced to such an extent that they had already started to divide and hand over the inheritance. In the end, the monsters left as quietly as they came. They waved their hands and left without a trace. It turned out that they had just put on a farce. Han Jin turned around and saw that Morrison's, Sunir, and the others all had strange expressions on their faces. Then, his expression should be similar. Han Jin was just about to say something when an idea flashed in his head. He hurriedly shouted, "Morrisons, take the people and keep moving forward. Hurry up. Leger, how are you feeling? Let Morrisons carry you in front and lead the way. We can't walk on the main road anymore. Try to walk on the smaller path." "I can do it," Leger hurriedly replied. Seeing that Han Jin was anxious, Morrison's didn't ask any more questions. He shouted, "If you don't want to die, get up now and follow me. Hurry up." "Sunir, you stay here with me." Han Jin paused. "Who has a mirror?" "What kind of mirror?" Chili asked. "Any kind. I have two here." Chili hurriedly took out a small mirror from her pocket and another from her bag. She handed it to Han Jin. "Who else has a mirror?" Han Jin shouted. Seeing that Han Jin needed a mirror, the villagers all gathered around. A moment later, there were more than 10 small mirrors in Han Jin's hands. He picked out 9 of them that were about the same size. Although these mirrors were all different in shape and quality, he couldn't be picky anymore. Han Jin's fingers quickly moved in the air, drawing one talisman after another. In the end, he sealed all the talismans in the mirrors. When the villagers saw that Morrison's hurriedly asked everyone to follow him, they knew that something was wrong. They all struggled to get up and followed behind Morrison's. The surroundings gradually became quiet. Han Jin glanced around and shouted in a low voice, "Go!" Then he threw all 9 mirrors out. The 9 mirrors spun rapidly in the air. With a boom, they turned into 9 dazzling rays of light and flew in all directions. They flew 100 meters away and landed on the ground at the same time. "What kind of magic did you cast?" Sunir asked in surprise. "A little trick to trick people." Han Jin looked at Sunir. In the past, when he chatted with Sunir, Sunir always looked indifferent. Now that she took off her mask, he realized that Sunir's face was full of expressions. Sunir saw that Han Jin was staring at her. She felt a little uncomfortable and put the mask back on her face. "Why are you still wearing that thing? What do you know?" Sunir said coldly. Han Jin smiled. "Lend me that green magic crystal again." Sunir threw the magic crystal to him and said, "Try to hurry up. I'm in more of a hurry than you are." Han Jin said with a smile. He thought about the various charms in Chapter Ding, A of the inner secret, and selected a suitable one. He then took out a piece of treefolk wood that had been cut and began to carve it carefully. Not long after, a lifelike little turtle appeared in Han Jin's hand. Han Jin drew a black tortoise holy charm and cast it on the little turtle. Then, he threw the little turtle out. A terrifying wave of energy swept across the field. Suddenly, a giant creature appeared in the field. It was a turtle that had been magnified thousands of times. Its back was about 3 meters tall and its huge shell was more than 5 meters in diameter. The surface of the turtle shell was very flat. It was big enough for a dozen people to sit on, or even more. Although Sunir was mentally prepared, she was still shocked by this giant creature. She took 2 steps back. "What is this thing?" Han Jin jumped onto the turtle's back and smiled. "Come on up." The 3-meter height was not a problem for Sunir. In the next moment, Sunir gently landed on the turtle's back. She curiously touched it a few times. "I've never heard of this kind of puppet. It should be very strong, right?" "It's not that strong. To me, it's just a carriage." Han Jin pointed. The giant turtle began to move, and it ran faster and faster. Sunir slowly sat down. The giant turtle had already left the main road and was running on the desolate field. However, the turtle's back was surprisingly stable. She could only feel a slight bump. "Why haven't you made this kind of thing before?" Sunir asked. She was a bit dissatisfied. She had been running until she was sweating. Just thinking about it made her feel wronged. "How should I put it? I have too many things here." Han Jin pointed at his head. "If it wasn't for Leger reminding me today, I wouldn't have remembered it." Han Jin bitterly smiled. "You mean you've mastered too many spells?" "Yes," Han Jin casually replied. "Ah." Sunir smiled. However, her tone was not very friendly. She felt that Han Jin was too arrogant. "Didn't you say that you wanted to see how far I could go?" Han Jin smiled. "I promise this is not the first surprise, and it won't be the last. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 88. Morrison's, Sassu, and the others suddenly heard a strange noise behind them. When they turned around, they were stunned. There were about 8 or 9 giant beasts forming a caravan. Han Jin and Sunir were standing on the back of the first giant beast, looking down at them. "What is this?" Morrison's yelled. "Come up first." Han Jin stopped the giant tortoise. Morrison's, Sassu, Chi, and the others all climbed onto the back of the giant tortoise. Following Han Jin's gesture, the giant tortoise slowly stood up and ran forward. Morrison squinted and looked behind them. All the villagers had squeezed onto the tortoise's back. Maybe it was because they were grateful, or maybe they were too excited, but there was a faint whimper. Chi curiously moved closer to Han Jin. She touched the rough tortoise and asked, "What kind of magic beast is this?" Note: it's a black tortoise. Because it needs to be spoken, one word is removed. Stand outside if you think too much. "I don't know what it's called either," Han Jin said, shaking his head. The 4 sacred beasts were the names of the Taoists. He could not explain it to Chi. "Raphael, I hate you," Morrison said, gritting his teeth. "Why didn't you use it earlier?" "I already asked him," Sunir said, smiling. "How did he explain it?" "He said that he had mastered too many spells, so he didn't think of it immediately. Thanks to Leger," he reminded him. How many spells do you know?" Morrison's yelled. "Now, use them one by one. Then we'll tell you when to do what. Unfortunately, I don't have any more magic power now. Otherwise, I could turn someone into a statue. Who should I experiment on?" Han Jin thought. Morrison's expression changed. He suddenly remembered that some buffs and effects could only be cast after the caster's spiritual power was locked onto a living being. In other words, if he continued to force Han Jin, he would definitely become a target. Morrison's laughed awkwardly. "Haha, don't be so serious. We're just joking." "I think you're right," Han Jin said, smiling. Morrison's was a bit nervous. He looked around and finally fixed his eyes on Sassu. Sassu was both angry and amused. He said softly, "Raphael, did you waste a lot of your magic power releasing these beasts? I didn't think that you would be so soft-hearted." "It has nothing to do with me." Han Jin pointed at Sunir. He still felt sorry for the magic power he had used. "If she didn't cry and make a fuss, what did you say?" Sunir said angrily. Han Jin chuckled. Although they used to work well together, Sunir always had a mask on her face. There was always a sense of estrangement. Now that Sunir had shown her real face, the estrangement gradually disappeared. In the past, no one would joke about Sunir under normal circumstances. As expected of a kind elf, Morrison's praised. "Raphael, have you used up all your magic power? Can you still fight?" Sassu asked. "No problem." Han Jin's smile suddenly froze on his face. He sensed that a group of vampires had broken into the mirror and were chasing in their direction. "Heaven and Earth Chaos, 9 Palaces Illusion, activate." Han Jin chanted the incantation and yelled. In the distance, the 9 small mirrors suddenly emitted a dazzling light, and beams of light shot into the deep starry sky. The group of flying vampires suddenly felt their vision blur, and then the whole world changed. Above, below, left, and right there were specks of starlight everywhere. The formation of the vampires immediately became chaotic, and they did not know where to fly. When pilots or migratory birds were flying on the sea at night, they were most afraid of encountering such a situation. The former would crash the plane and kill the passengers, while the latter would crash into the sea in group. Their senses would be seriously inverted. This phenomenon was known as the graveyard spiral. As the name suggested, one could imagine how terrible it was when one's senses were inverted. For the group of vampires, They had never encountered such a situation since they mastered the flying technique. Their formation went from chaotic to chaotic, and in the end, it was complete chaos. They even kept colliding with each other. Those with physical strength were almost knocked down like stones, but they desperately flapped their wings and flew up again. Then, they were knocked down again. Even the vampire commander was confused. Some vampires locked onto a star and desperately flew forward. It was a good idea to lock onto a reference star, but the position of the illusory stars was constantly changing. As a result, the vampires kept flying in circles. Some went up and down, some went left and right. They all thought that they were right and screamed for their companions to follow them. In the end, it became more and more chaotic. Sunir noticed that Han Jin's expression was a little strange. She hurriedly asked, "What's wrong?" "Those vampires have caught up." Han Jin let out a long sigh. Morrison's, Sasu, and the others suddenly turned around and looked back. "What are you looking at?" "They are now trapped by my magic array." "Trapped?" Sasu said in surprise and joy. "How long can you trap them?" "It's hard to say. It depends on luck." Han Jin said with a bitter smile. "If we are lucky, we can trap them until dawn. If we are unlucky, they will catch up immediately." His energy was limited, and the materials he could use were very poor. Therefore, the 9 Palaces illusionary light array could not exert its power. The vampires fell to the ground from time to time. As long as one of the vampires happened to break any of the mirrors, the 9 Palaces illusionary light array would immediately collapse. Even if the mirrors were intact, the vampires that fell to the ground could walk out of the range of the 9 Palaces illusionary light array if they closed their eyes and kept walking forward. The problem was, when would they be able to calm down? Depends on luck? What does that mean? Sasu asked, puzzled. With his understanding of magic, it was either possible or impossible. What was the use of luck? Let's talk about it later. Han Jin looked back at Leger. Leger, you lead the way. The farther we are from the main road, the safer it is. Can I control it? Leger asked in surprise. Just tell me where to go. Han Jin was the last person who liked to gamble on luck. It felt uncontrollable, but this time, he won the gamble. He ran until the giant tortoise's spiritual energy ran out. Then he made another 8 or 9 giant tortoises. In the end, after running for an entire night, the vampires still did not catch up. They could vaguely see a village in front of them, and the giant tortoise's spiritual energy was exhausted again. Han Jin jumped down from the giant tortoise's back. The whole team stopped as well. He really did not have the energy to make more charms. For an entire night, Morrison's and the others could eat and sleep. Only he and Leger could not. Leger only needed to tell him where to go, but he had to divide his spiritual energy to firmly control the 9 giant tortoises. He was already exhausted. The 2 batches of Black Tortoise Sacred Spell had cost him almost 10,000 yuan of energy. His total energy was only slightly more than 100 unit. He would be lying to himself if he said he did not feel the pinch. However, seeing the emotions of the villagers and the others, he felt a little bit better. Sunir, Sasu, and the others jumped down to the ground. Morrison's, Sylvia and the mercenaries were still sleeping. Han Jin was a little annoyed because it was too unfair. He waved his hand, and the giant tortoises suddenly disappeared. Morrison's and the others fell from the sky and landed on the ground with a loud thud. However, Morrison's physique was undeniable. He was extremely strong. He jumped up from the ground and shouted, "What's going on? The vampires are here?" "It's nothing." The golem's effect suddenly disappeared. Han Jin smiled. "Yeah, it was very sudden." Sunir sighed softly. Sylvia could not tell anything was wrong. She only knew that she was unlucky. Morrison's looked at Han Jin and Sunir suspiciously. Why didn't the other golems disappear? Only ours disappeared? I don't know. Morrison's opened his mouth, but the situation was too much for him. He could only mumble something and sit down in the wilderness. To be honest, he was still very, very tired. Sasu, go to the town in front and ask where we are, Hanjin said. Okay. Sasu nodded. I'll go too. Leger stood up. Your injury. It's not a problem for me to walk. Leger smiled. He was too ashamed to eat and drink, so he just wanted to do something. Then you two go together. Be careful. Hanjin said softly. You saved us all. Sunir watched Sasu and Leger leave and said slowly. I also did it to save myself. Hanjin smiled. A few months ago, you were able to escape from hundreds of nights in the Holy Crown City. You must have some special magic, right? I wonder, can those vampires really hurt you? I escaped alone? Hanjin paused. But my wealth is still here. Should I abandon everything? Wealth? Do you mean? For example, Stillberg, Morrison's, Sasu. Hanjin smiled. And you, Chili. Sunir was angry and amused at the same time. If Hanjin was serious, how could he compare people to private wealth? If Hanjin was joking, he really didn't abandon them. Friendship is priceless. Sunir rolled her eyes at Hanjin. Of course, so I can't give up anyway. You. Sunir looked at Hanjin's profile. Half a year ago, Hanjin was just an ordinary prophet without any prediction ability. Now, Hanjin set up a magic circle to trap those vampires and released the puppet beasts to help them escape. Without Hanjin, they would have been in big trouble. In such a short time, he had become the mainstay of the team from an ordinary person. His growth was really impressive. He had known Sylvia for so many years, but he had never seen Sylvia show such a shy expression. He felt like his chest was going to explode. Ahem. Hanjin coughed dryly. What a waste of words. He had repeated countless times just now. Women have to be gentle, 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 gentle. Did Sylvia listen carefully? Sylvia suddenly reacted. She tried her best to put on an affectionate expression and even winked at him. There are so many people here. I'll talk to you later, okay? Can you please? Sasu and the others were all stunned. They were familiar with Sylvia, who was always energetic. When had Sylvia ever shown such an expression? Even Morrison's was stunned. After a while, he stuttered. You? Are you all right? Did you accidentally get bitten by a vampire? Sylvia was furious. She wanted to punch Morrison's in the face and stomp on his face. However, Hanjin's words were still beside her ears. She tried her best to control her emotions. She twisted her body and said coquettishly, "You're so annoying." However, she was a little too strong. She actually knocked Morrison's over. At this time, the villagers knew that the west side of the city was about 20 miles ahead. They rushed towards Hanjin and the others. Since they were about to part ways, they wanted to express their gratitude. However, they were different from the nobles. They had almost no education and their vocabulary was very limited. They kept saying thank you over and over again. A few of the leaders even asked the villagers to pay Hanjin and the others. However, Hanjin did not care about this small amount of money. He did not protect the villagers for the sake of money. Both sides pushed and pushed for a long time. In the end, Sunir persuaded them that they would not be able to find a job in the west side of the city. They still had to rely on that small amount of money to survive. Only then did the villagers take the money back. After that, they continued to drag things out for a long time. Hanjin's head was sweating. He was not used to this kind of scene and was a little annoyed. The other side said, "Thank you." This side said, "You're welcome." The other side said, "Thank you again." He said, "Don't be so polite again." Then the other side said, "Thank you again." In the end, Hanjin was speechless. He wanted to hit someone. After sending the villagers off with great difficulty, Han Jin purposely waited for a while to avoid bumping into them again. They first went to the village in front of them to have some food before continuing on the main road. Other than Han Jin, who was a little listless, everyone was in a good mood. After all, they had rested for a whole night. They chatted and laughed loudly as they hurried on. Morrison's had already forgotten about the unpleasantness just now. He chatted happily with Sylvia and even walked at the front. Perhaps this was the instinct of a warrior. The others could just watch from behind. If they had known that there were countless vampires gathered 30 miles behind them, desperately searching for something, they would have started running away. Due to their special physique, vampires would not sweat under normal circumstances. However, the vampire named Blake was sweating profusely at this moment. His hands and feet were trembling slightly. "You still haven't found it?" Caroline said coldly. In order to catch the culprit and avenge her child, she did not hesitate to personally participate in the pursuit. "Why don't you look elsewhere?" "My lady, they can't have gone far," Blake replied firmly. "There are almost 400 of them in total. They don't have any carriages. Although we are trapped by that strange magic formation, they can't have gone more than 10 miles in this period of time. I'm guessing they must be hiding in the magic formation." "You're saying that they're still nearby?" "Definitely, my lady. I'm willing to guarantee it with my life." Caroline nodded slightly. She trusted her subordinate's judgment. That team was made up of a mercenary team and hundreds of villagers. If the mercenary team did not care about the lives of the villagers and escaped alone, they might be able to escape far away. However, it was impossible for the villagers to escape, and it was impossible for all of them to disappear. They must be hiding somewhere. On the other side, Han Jin and his companions were approaching the West City. After the internal division of the Bite Man, all the Castellans had spared no expense in running their own nests. The defense facilities of the West City were not much worse than those of the capital Bite Man City. The tall city walls were all built with special bricks, which were the corundum made by alchemists. They had extremely strong physical and magical defense. 2 magic crystal cannons were placed near each city gate. As for the power of the magic crystal cannons, the distance, and the equivalent consumption of the magic crystals, these were military secret. Behind the city walls, there were rows of magic defense towers and arrow towers. Such a grand scene would make people dumbfounded. It even made people wonder if there were so many magicians in the West City. The city gate was heavily guarded. About hundreds of fully armed soldiers were checking the pedestrians. The outside of the city was crowded with people who wanted to enter, but almost no one wanted to leave. The news of the large-scale invasion of the Vampire Guard had spread out. Although the West City did not have enough soldiers to encircle and annihilate the vampires, it should not be a problem to protect the main city. Of course, this depended on how determined the vampires were. After waiting for a long time, it was finally Han Jin and his companions' turn. When the soldiers of the West City saw the badge on Morrison's chest, they immediately smiled and welcomed Han Jin and his companions in without even checking. They knew that if the vampires really wanted to besiege the West City, these mercenaries would definitely help the West City. In the past, they did not welcome mercenaries. The mercenaries were too flamboyant and did not like to be restrained. They would cause trouble every day. But now, they really hoped that the mercenaries would gather in the West City. If there were enough mercenaries, they could spread out the regular army and launch a counterattack. In the past 6 months, Han Jin had been to a few places, but he had never been as welcomed as he was now. The commander of the city gate actually sent 4 high-ranked warriors to lead the way for Han Jin and his companions. They were very concerned about their well-being. When they found out that Han Jin and his companions did not want to stay in a hotel and wanted to rent a courtyard by themselves, one of the high-ranked warriors ran out. It did not take long for him to contact Han Jin and his companions to find a place to stay. The property of the courtyard was owned by a small businessman. He also wanted to be neighbors with some professionals, so the rent was very cheap. It was only a little more than 1 gold coin a month. Before the warriors left, they tactfully discussed with Han Jin. They hoped that Han Jin and his companions would report to the city hall. If the vampires launched a large-scale attack on the West City, they would resist with the other mercenaries in an organized manner. If there was no organization, it would be very chaotic. Han Jin and his companions agreed to this request without hesitation. They had endured all the way here. They had a deep understanding of the cruelty and violence of the vampires. If the West City was breached, the people would be plunged into misery and suffering. It was only right for them to contribute. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 90. Life became peaceful again. However, everyone was used to the fluctuating between relaxation and nervousness. Their mentality changed very quickly, and they forgot about the hardships of the past few days. They did what they were supposed to do and lived a carefree life. There was also a branch of Morgan and Company in the west side of the city. Logically speaking, Han Jin should have discussed with Sunir, Sasu, and the others how to get in touch with the people of Morgan and Company. However, Han Jin locked himself in his room and told Stilberg to tell everyone that he was going to meditate and would not see anyone for the next few days. After 3 days, Han Jin finally walked out of his room. For Morrison's, who spent every day either practicing swordsmanship or messing around with Sylvia, his appearance meant that his happy days had come to an end. In the room, Sasu had just finished meditating. He was about to light the firewood in the fireplace when he felt a sudden gust of cold wind. He couldn't help but shrink his neck and look back. It was Morrison's who had opened the door from the outside. He was poking his head in to see what he was doing. "Are you coming in or not?" Sasu frowned. Although it was already early spring, it was unusually cold today. He had to continue meditating later, and the temperature in the room had a great impact on him. "Shoo!" Morrison's entered the room in a flash and closed the door behind him. He looked around cautiously before letting out a long breath. "Thank God Raphael is not here." Sasu looked at Morrison's with an amused expression. "Is Raphael that scary?" Morrison's glanced at Sasu and threw the wooden shield in his hand to the ground. He sneered. "No, not at all. You can try. I will recommend you to Raphael." "Ugh, forget it." Sasu turned his head away and released a small fireball. The firewood in the fireplace emitted a burst of green smoke and burned fiercely. "Humph." Morrison snorted loudly and sat down by the fireplace. He purposely squeezed Sasu to the side. "You!" Sasu was almost pushed to the ground. He stood up and was about to say something when he saw the bruises on Morrison's face. He couldn't help but laugh in his heart. After Han Jin finished meditating, he announced that he had found the weakness of Berserk and corrected it. Morrison's could not avoid the fate of being a target. In the team, he was the only one with thick skin. How could he let Han Jin hit Chili? Perhaps he could kill Cherry with just one punch. However, the result was disappointing. Of course, that was true for Morrison's. The others didn't care. They just wanted to watch the show. Han Jin lost control again. Although Han Jin said that Morrison's could block and counterattack, Morrison's could only release his combat aura to protect himself. Occasionally, he would block, but he never counterattacked. In Morrison's words, Han Jin was so delicate that he was afraid that he could poke a hole in Han Jin's body with his finger. The sad thing was that Han Jin was very handsome and young. Morrison's beard had grown out again. He was tall and burly, just like an uncle. If Han Jin punched Han Jin in the face a few times, everyone would laugh and not take it to heart. However, if Morrison's counterattacked and knocked Han Jin down with a few punches, everyone would stand up and denounce him. There was no such thing as fairness in the world. Moxink was well aware of his own limitations in this respect. What was even sadder was that Han Jin became faster and faster after he went berserk. His movements became fiercer and fiercer. He was like a wild beast that had been imprisoned for hundreds of years and finally regained its freedom. Morrison's was determined not to fight back. It was easy to imagine what would happen to him. At this time, the door was pushed open from the outside. Han Jin walked in and was surprised to see the two people in the room. Morrison's, so you're here. Before Morrison's could lament about being caught by this devil, Han Jin said, Sasu, what made you laugh like that? Tell me. Nothing. Sasu smiled. You're here to experiment with Morrison's? Yes. Han Jin nodded. Morrison's looked at Han Jin sadly. Can't you wait until I'm better? Look, here and here. Morrison's pointed his thick fingers at his face as he spoke. Han Jin smiled. Really, there won't be a problem this time. Won't? Morrison's eyes widened. You said the same thing last time, right? And the time before that. Can't you ask Sunir for this experiment? She's so close to you. With a creak, the door opened again. Morrison's heart skipped a beat, as if something bad was about to happen. It turned out that a man's intuition could be very accurate sometimes. Morrison's was a good example. Sunir walked in and looked at Morrison's with a half-smile. What did you just say? I said. Morrison's suddenly thought of an idea. I said that if you're not here, we can't do the experiment. What if Raphael loses control again? It won't happen this time, Sunir said with a smile. It won't happen? Morrison's looked suspicious. Han Jin's promise was not trustworthy. He had been tricked a few times, but Sunir's promise was more convincing. Morrison's hesitated for a while. You two. You're not colluding with each other to set me up, are you? You. Sunir was furious. Colluding was a terrible word. Morrison's finally realized what he had said. He hurriedly picked up the wooden shield and walked out. I'm ready. Let's go outside now, he said generously. Actually, I don't need that anymore. Han Jin pointed at the wooden shield in Morrison's hand. What? Morrison's university was shocked. Are you going to use me as a target? Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, Han Jin turned into a different person. His eyes were like two unsheathed swords. Morrison's felt as if something was scraping his face. He could see that Han Jin's body was bigger than usual even through his clothes. His bulging muscles contained a terrifying explosive power. It can't be like this, Morrison's lamented in his heart. They hadn't even reached the outside yet. Why did it start already? It didn't matter if he was hit because he had combat energy to protect himself. However, if he broke anything in the house, he would have to pay for it. Even if he didn't break anything, it wouldn't be good if he touched the plants. Morrison's didn't notice that Han Jin's eyes were very clear. It was just that they were covered by the sharpness in his eyes. Han Jin stomped heavily on the ground. His body shot out like an arrow, leaving a trail of afterimages in the air. The bricks he stomped on were instantly smashed into pieces. Morrison's growled and released his combat energy to protect himself. He then placed the wooden shield in front of him. Han Jin's right hand slammed onto the wooden shield. If one could slow down the action, one could clearly see that before Han Jin's hand touched the wooden shield, the pressure between his hand and the wooden shield had already caused Morrison's to stagger backward. In the next moment, Han Jin's hand finally hit the wooden shield. The wooden shield shattered into countless pieces. However, Morrison's didn't feel any impact. The wooden shield was too fragile and shattered too quickly. Morrison's didn't have time to think too much. He yelled, Sunir, quick! He's out of control again! Surprisingly, there was no flash of white light, nor was there another attack. The house fell into an eerie silence. You! Morrison's was stunned. He raised his finger and pointed at Han Jin in disbelief. You saw it too. Sunir didn't stop me this time. I can control myself, Han Jin said calmly. It's a success? Morrison still couldn't believe it. He stared blankly for a while before bursting into laughter. Han Jin's experiment was a success. The happiest person wasn't Han Jin, but Morrison's. He could finally walk out of his misery. Don't worry about it now? Sunir asked with a teasing smile in her eyes. It was too early for him to be happy. Morrison sighed. Raphael, how did you stay conscious? It's nothing. Stilberg gave me some inspiration. Him? What inspiration did he give you? You won't understand if I explain it to you. Han Jin said awkwardly. He couldn't explain it at all. He used Taoist spells, not magic. Wait. Morrison's finally realized. Since it's a success, why are you still looking for me? Use your sword and fight me with all your strength. I need to know how powerful I am after going berserk. Are you kidding? Morrison suddenly asked seriously. Kidding? Han Jin frowned. It was his turn to be confused. If you want me to do the experiment, I can accompany you. At most, I'll be beaten up by you. Morrison's had a serious expression. If you want me to draw my sword, you should find someone else. Sylvia and I grew up together, but we've never fought. Do you know why? Why? Because our teacher told us that swords are used to kill, not for fun. Every time you draw your sword, you must have the courage and will to kill your opponent. Otherwise, don't draw your sword. Didn't you fight Stilberg before? How is that the same? Stilberg and I were just playing around. Morrison shook his head. With your current speed and strength, do you think I'm qualified to play around with you? Then do your best. Don't worry, I'll be fine. Before coming to find Morrison's, he had already made a talisman for faked EarthCorp. In other words, even if Morrison's accidentally hit his vitals, he would still be fine. You're crazy, but I can't be crazy with you. Morrison's was surprisingly firm and serious. I refuse. Han Jin smiled bitterly. Morrison's was usually easy to talk to, but when he was really stubborn, it was quite frustrating. Han Jin's gaze turned to Sunir. Do you think I can control the arrow I shoot? Sunir rolled her eyes at Han Jin. I refuse as well. Don't look at me, even a Grand Magus can't take back a spell that has been released. Sasu blocked Morrison's way of talking. Being invincible is the loneliest. Han Jin let out a long sigh. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 91. Life was a balance between work and rest. If they were hiding in the mountains or forests, they would not think so much, but it was different in the city. On this day, Morrison strongly requested to go out for a walk. Ever since they moved in, Han Jin and Sunir had set a rule that Michel and Stilberg were in charge of the daily necessities. In other words, apart from them, no one else was allowed to leave the yard. Their only task was to cultivate. Han Jin knew that it was not easy for Morrisons to endure the heavy traffic outside for a few days. After pondering for a while, he felt that it was time for everyone to go out for some fresh air. It would be a problem if they stayed at home all the time. In the end, only Sasu, Chili, and Michel did not want to go out. The others walked out of the yard one after another. Stilberg had the opportunity to go shopping every day, so there was no need for him to follow them. However, it was his instinct. Unless Han Jin said it explicitly, he would always follow Han Jin. The most excited person was Sylvia. Regardless of whether she gave people the impression that she had big breasts but no brains, or that she had long hair but short knowledge, she had a certain level of discipline. Besides, what she had seen and heard in the past few days was more thrilling and exciting than all her previous experiences combined. Even the most arrogant person would subconsciously choose to keep a low profile when they realized that life was not as easy as they thought it would be. Leger, on the other hand, was even more low-key than Sylvia. According to Han Jin's observation, this man did not like to laugh or get angry. When everyone was talking, he would always sit quietly on the side. He was even more ladylike than Chile. Morrison's would ask Han Jin to come over when he was free, but Leger never took the initiative to ask. When Han Jin helped him, he would express his gratitude. When Han Jin did not help him, he would remain silent, similar to Sunir. Now, he was wearing the mage cloak that he had borrowed from Sasu. It covered his entire face, and no one could see his face clearly. He walked silently, as if he was floating. Ha, bar! Morrison's suddenly yelled. Not only were the people shocked by Morrison's, even the pedestrians on the street were frightened. A few crows that were perched on the trees screamed and flapped their wings to escape into the night sky. Raphael, let's go in and take a seat. Morrison smiled. Most mercenaries could not live without alcohol, and bars were the best places to hire mercenaries, exchange experiences, and gather information. You guys! Sunir laughed. Han Jin raised his head to look at the bar's name. It was Night Rose. He was worried. Let's make this clear first. We'll only drink. Don't cause any trouble. Trouble? Morrison's University laughed. Do you mean other people will come and mess with us, or do you mean we'll mess with other people? There was a reason why Morrison's was so arrogant. He was a fighter, Sunir was a heart-piercing archer, and Leger who had mastered invisibility. Even the weakest among them was a 7th-grade professional. With Han Jin, who was a master of all kinds of professions, their strength could be considered as outstanding in the mercenary world. Although they were far from being comparable to the Red Vanguards, their combination of professions was perfect. They were good at both close combat and long-range attack. Normal mercenaries would be asking for trouble if they dared to mess with them. You! Han Jin was speechless. However, Morrison's was in high spirits, and he did not want to be a wet blanket. They didn't notice, nor could they notice, that the whole West City was covered with crows. When the few crows were scared away by Moxink, the other crows also flew up into the sky and left West City one after another. Maybe they had found what they were looking for and didn't need to stay here any longer. As soon as they opened the door, a wave of noise rushed towards them. A large number of mercenaries had gathered in the west side of the city, and the small bar was almost full. As soon as Han Jin and the others stepped into the bar, they attracted a lot of attention. Usually, people would come to the bar in 2s or 3s. It was rare for so many people to come to the bar together. The tables in the bar were a little small, so Han Jin and the others had to sit at 2 tables. Give me a dozen ale. Morrison's shouted as soon as his but touched the chair. Don't drink too much. For some reason, Sylvia's voice sounded a little gentle. She didn't know what was wrong with Moxink. Logically speaking, he should be happy to be treated like this by Silner. However, instead of responding to Silner's tenderness, Moxink glared at her and said, "It's a man's business. Women should mind their own business." Sylvia was about to explode when she suddenly remembered what Han Jin said. Men usually like gentle women. Sylvia quickly lowered her head and clenched her teeth. She kept encouraging herself in her heart. Sylvia, you are a lady. You are the most gentle lady in the world. Sylvia finally calmed herself down. She lifted her head and put on a gentle smile. Although the smile looked forced, it was already Sylvia's limit. It's not good for your body to drink too much, Sylvia said softly. She shivered inwardly and felt goosebumps all over her body. She thought that this should show her concern for Morrison's. Unfortunately, Morrison's did not feel Sylvia's concern for him. He only felt great. Look, the tigress had turned into a lamb. What a sense of accomplishment! To show his manliness, Morrison's picked up a cup of ale and downed it in one gulp. Nice. Morrison slammed the cup on the table and burped. Sylvia was not happy. What? Did I say all that for nothing? Bang! Silner pounded the table heavily, which startled Moxink. I told you to stop drinking. Sylvia's voice was a little loud. The customers at the table next to them looked over curiously. If it was only the two of them, Morrison's might have stopped drinking. However, he could not bring himself to do so in front of so many people. Do you have the final say, or do I? Morrison's glared at Sylvia. He picked up another cup of ale and downed it in one gulp. You have the final say. Of course, you have the final say. Sylvia laughed coldly. Morrison's looked at Sylvia's smile, and felt that something was wrong. However, he could not back down now. He braced himself and said, It's good that you know. Let me tell you, when men are drinking, women should not interrupt. Morrison stared at Sylvia as he spoke. He was afraid that she would say something embarrassing again. To his surprise, Sylvia only glanced at him and turned her head away. Morrison's heaved a sigh of relief when he saw Sylvia's reaction. He was puzzled. Why was Sylvia's temper so good today? But the next moment, Moxink overturned his idea. Give me a dozen as well, Sylvia yelled as she glanced at Morrison's. Her expression clearly said that she would drink as much as he wanted. Morrison's scalp went numb. He knew the consequences of Sylvia drinking too much. What are you drinking? Is this appropriate? When women are drinking, men should not interrupt, Sylvia said through gritted teeth. Morrison's turned his head to look at Han Jean and the others. He realized that they were all in a heated discussion and no one was paying attention to him. This made Morrison's feel relieved. Otherwise, it would be too embarrassing to be scolded by Sylvia in front of so many people. Morrison's could no longer hold back his anger when he saw the ale being served to Sylvia. It was fine if he lost out in words, but if Sylvia drank too much, he would be the unlucky one. Sis, don't drink any more, Morrison said softly. Why should I? You drink yours, and I'll drink mine. Let's not care about each other. Sylvia was still angry. How could she listen to him? Sister, I was wrong. Look, I don't want to drink any more. Moxink forced a smile and pushed the wine glass in front of him to the side. Humph! Sylvia harumphed coldly and turned her head away, leaving Morrison's with the back of her head. Morrison's did not dare to say anything. Sylvia could say anything to him, as long as she did not touch the ale on the table. Sis, I was wrong, okay? Ah. A sarcastic voice suddenly came from the table beside them. Morrison's was furious. He turned around and saw a customer at the table next to them. The customer was holding a seductively dressed woman in his arms. The customer was pointing at them and laughing loudly from time to time. Morrison's was about to rush over and teach the arrogant guy a lesson, but someone was faster than him. A red shadow flashed beside him, and Sylvia was already standing in front of the customer's table. What are you laughing at? I'm talking to you, Sylvia shouted angrily. What? I can't even laugh? You're being too nosy. The customer did not care about Sylvia at all. He still had a carefree look on his face. Han Jean and Sunir looked at each other. He had already told them to only drink and not cause trouble. They did not expect trouble to happen before they even warmed up their chairs. However, it was the other party who provoked them first. They could not blame Morrison's and Sylvia. Han Jean gave Stilberg a look. Stilberg hurriedly stood up and walked over to Sylvia. Miss Sylvia, people like him are everywhere. Please don't lower yourself to his level. Seeing Stilberg walk over, Sylvia remembered Han Jin's warning. She harumphed coldly and turned around to leave. However, the customer was not having it. He glared at Stilberg and said angrily, How can you say that? Say it again and let me hear it. Stilberg was so scared that he took a step back. He said timidly, I don't know how to speak. I stutter when I see a lot of people. It's like a sheep taking a dump. It's not to your taste. Please forgive me. Han Jean and the others were stunned for a moment. Then, they burst into laughter. They had seen people curse others before, but none of them had seen someone curse in such a way. Morrison's even laughed and patted Stillberg's shoulder heavily. He even gave him a thumbs up. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.